Okay,
Yeah.
let's start the text. So Sharon says, I am the defender of the text. So sorry to miss you all last week. A combination of bad sleep Monday combined with really exciting thing for me at work. Tash Hospital, which Tash stands to Tikur Ambessa. It stands for Black Lion. It means Black Lion in one of the Ethiopian languages. Black Lion Hospital in Addis Ababa, Ethiopia, is adopting our lung cancer screening software. So I had to do meetings and
Hot dog.
yeah, I know I'm really excited.
What are they adopting? The spiral CT or the whole recommendation? What are they adopting?
The whole
In segments
recommendation.
or the totality of it? Oh, that's really good.
Yeah, yeah. So as soon as we get these servers operational for them, then our medical experts will start the training with them to show them how to do the new protocols to detect cancer early. So, and it's a major concern in Ethiopia. They have high cancer rates, so they're keen to get going, and we're keen to get them there. So, yay! It's a tiny little piece of the whole problem of the world, but it's a little piece I've got some leverage on, so I'm going to push on that lever and see what good I
It's
can
a
do.
step forward. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. So anyway, now that we've had the kickoff meeting, we can be more flexible about scheduling future meetings, and it shouldn't get in the way of our Monday calls.
Okay, good.
So it was just finding a time for the first one because they're 11 hours away from me. So, somebody has to be there at a weird time. We decided it was us. We did a 5 a.m. call our time. Yeah, so anyway, but let's return to our seminar because we're live streaming and recording, and I bet there are people who'd like to hear about Kenneth Smith. So when last we left our intrepid heroes 2 weeks ago, we were continuing. We're now on our 132nd seminar in a row about Kenneth Smith's forthcoming book, Millennia and Microcosm, which was published as columns in the late 90s and early 2000s in the back of a magazine called the Comics Journal. And David and I are putting it together for Kenneth into a book form. And as part of that, we're doing this seminar where we're going in depth through every line of the book together to unpack Kenneth Smith's rich, dense, elusive text and take notes on what we ought to footnote in the book to help readers. So all of y'all probably did belong in the credits as part of the reviewers. In fact, I think it's safe to say when we publish the book, that's exactly what we're going to do. If you guys are all game, is we'll put you on the list as reviewers, and thank you heartily for your in-depth exploration of the issues
Hey,
and
Rick, I have to correct you at the meeting in a row. I mean, when we skipped last week, isn't that a
okay.
broken chain? I mean, like, is that is that in a row?
But persistence, it's all about continuing after
Okay.
interruptions, right?
No, I'm
That's how
just
it
kidding.
works. So we're just continuing. So we're in the medieval epoch, which is the second section of the book. It's a large. The second and third sections are larger than the first section. We're in the medieval epoch. We're in chapter 5, which is the first of the chapters that's introducing the breakaway as the medieval epoch rose up to contest and ultimately replace the classical ancient epoch. So this chapter is all about the harsh, strong contrasts. What's different about the medieval worldview compared to the ancient worldview, and really dramatizing what an enormous change it was. Because as we've seen, we're only at paragraph 12 so far in this chapter, but already it's crystal clear how many of the central, kind of pivotal points of the value system of the ancient world have been not just changed, but completely inverted. The things that were the most important to the ancients as virtues are now being held up as the worst of vices, and vice versa. Ha ha ha. Things that were considered vices by the ancients are in some cases being upheld as the greatest of virtues. And so it's not the kind of change that incrementalists look for. Incrementalists assume we get from the past to the future through a long series of small changes. But there are periods in history when the pace of change accelerates, and in some cases, so dramatically that you have to call the result a revolution. Nietzsche called this what, a revaluation of values, right? There was just a complete transformation about what's good and what's bad, what's important and what's unimportant. So we're continuing in that, and we got through paragraph 11 2 weeks ago and halfway through paragraph 12. But since it's been 2 weeks, I'm going to back us up to the start of paragraph 12, which we'll skim through to get down to the part where we left off. And I think there's a good chance we'll make it to paragraph 13 today too. We'll see how it goes. And what we're talking about here is the way, even from the opening sentence, for Christianity leveled all human and social accomplishments to the same debilitating futility and meaninglessness. Kenneth's talking about here is how, in the classical ancient worldview, they saw nature as hierarchical. Some things are more important than others, right? I mean, if you're starving to death and somebody offers you a Lego set, this is not a solution, right? Your priority should be the food. You're hungry, you need food, right? When you need water, you don't say, well, here's a collectible card trading card game. This is called Magic the Gathering. You can sit down and play with your friends. I need water. I don't want that, right? There's hierarchies of concern. Some things matter more than others. And there's hierarchies of expertise. A cheetah can outrun a human being. On foot, I mean, yes, if we get a card, that's great. But on foot, the cheetah's going to be faster than we are. And that's just the way it is. That's just how nature is. Every different kind of strength or virtue that you can imagine, some species have it more than others, and some individuals have it more than others. The ancients looked out into nature and they saw an unequal world. And they saw that nature had found a way to create a kind of justice out of inequality, in which the purpose of inequality is not to exploit the weak. The purpose of inequality is to recognize that different people are good at different things. You need a diversity of skills and talents in your culture. You need a diversity of inputs. If you don't have that diversity, you might be sacrificing your own culture. You might be about to die because you're going to desperately need a skill set that you've stomped down to try to make everybody the same. So you want to lift the bottom, but you don't want to crush the top. You want your Mozarts. You want your Martin Luther King Jr.'s. You want your people who have a talent to be able to flourish and turn it up to 11 so that all of society benefits from it. This is what they're looking for. And they see this as a matter of core survival. Heraclitus talks about this, Aristotle talks about this, Plato talks about this. They all talk about inequality in these positive terms. Now, it's not to say that the way that they organized society was optimal, right? Because all of these philosophical ideas come along after they've already conquered the indigenous populations of the Greek peninsula and enslaved them. And then afterwards, they're trying to rationalize it. And in order to make the rationalization persuasive, they improve it over the centuries until it's actually quite a good description of nature and human nature. And the only real problem with it is that's not the way they've organized their societies, right? The slaves aren't the people who are inferior. The slaves are whoever they beat militarily and enslaved. So they've got a mismatch between their political economy and social structures on the one hand, and this really elegant philosophy, political philosophy of how society ought to be organized. And by the time Plato and Aristotle and Socrates are working, it has become apparent to everybody that Greek society has serious problems. Well, those problems are nothing compared to what happened by the time we get to the Roman Empire, especially the late Roman Empire. It is just rotten to the core, and nobody believes in it. I mean, you can still find diehard ideologues is what I want, who are committed to the ideology, and every time they see something that contradicts their ideology, they just forget about it at once or rationalize it away. And then every time they see something that lines up with their ideology, they throw a spotlight on it and tell all their friends about it and say, see, this proves that Rome is just and Pax Romana, and it's all beautiful and great. But most people aren't able to ignore their, as Joe and Sharon were saying, their hungry stomachs. How come this provincial governor who's supposed to be helping our province flourish, instead it's loot and pillage, right? I mean, he's appointed for a certain term of office, and while he's in there, he's taking everything he can get. And when his term of office is over, he's going to run home with all of his pelf and say, yay, I won. And they're saying, this sucks so bad, we would rather be invaded by barbarians and have the Roman Empire overthrown than keep going the way we're going, because this is just dreadful. So these are the circumstances. The Roman Empire, late Roman Empire, is betraying the promise of the classical epoch so intensively that hardly anybody believes in it. It has enormous power, has enormous momentum, but it's lost faith. Nobody believes in it, right? Even the people who are benefiting from it are mostly cynical about it. So this is the atmosphere in which the early Christian church fathers, who are laying the groundwork for what's going to become the medieval epoch, are launching their criticism after criticism after criticism against the Roman Empire generally and against the ancient worldview specifically. And what's interesting about their approach, the first interesting thing about their approach is the way that they're turning the value system topsy-turvy, which I'm going to talk about in a second. But the second interesting thing about it is that they're not critiquing like Athens at its prime. They're critiquing the most rotten form of the ancient world. And they have confused, or they are seeing the rot as not a fall from the ideal form of the classical worldview, but as a core symptom of what is essential to the classical worldview. That is, they're not saying the problem with the world is that we've fallen from the peak, the flourishing peak of the classical worldview. They're saying the problem is the classical worldview itself. We wouldn't have all this corruption if it weren't for the classical worldview. And in their writings, they really don't have much to say about the golden age of the classical era. They hardly ever write about that. It's as though it's inconvenient for their ideology that there have been an era in which the ancient world did anything right. So all they focus on is the end period, which makes sense. That's the period they're living in. What is actually happening today? What are we suffering under? And at that point, when corrupt governors are spewing this rationalization and propaganda about how it's supposed to work, and then pretending that that's the way it does work, you can see why people would absolutely lose faith with the old system and say, I don't care if it ever did work. At this point, all it is a club that you guys are hitting us over the head with in order to rationalize your behavior while you pick our pockets, right? So you can see how people are really ready to hear a counter message. And so this opening sentence, what he's giving us is a counter message that is saying hierarchies, they're bad, right? They're just bad. Nobody's better than anybody else. Everybody's equal. And on the one hand, this obviously, first of all, it flies in the face of the political economy, which is the point. They're saying nobody should, be so rich and powerful that they can call themselves God and demand that people treat them that way. The Caesars, the emperors, should not be claiming to be gods. They're just people. We've had it with this hierarchical political economy. But in pursuit of that criticism, they're generalizing to say it's also the case that it doesn't do any good to have anybody be faster than anybody else. It doesn't do any good to have anybody be smarter than anybody else. It doesn't do any good that Mozart could be a better musician than me, who can't play a piano at all. It doesn't do any good that Martin Luther King can be this incredibly persuasive moral orator who can mobilize millions. None of that matters. All hierarchies are bad. It's all stupid and worthless. And part of the justification for doing that is we're sick of the hierarchies of the Roman Empire. But the other justification is none of the hierarchies among human beings is as great as the hierarchy between man and God. God is infinitely smarter, infinitely more powerful, and infinitely better than we are. And nothing any human being ever does will ever approach the level that God's at. So shut up, right? This is the argument. You're all essentially the same, right? All of this striving for greatness is the problem, they say, because it leads people to think about climbing on top of one another when they should be thinking about lifting each other up. And so what we've got here is a completely understandable conflation of two different kinds of hierarchies into the same idea. Hierarchies of oppression are bad, right? They've all had it. Everybody, this persuades everybody. But they're saying hierarchies of expertise and diligence and practice and effort and trying and accomplishment are also bad, right? Who's Sharon to think that she's a better anesthesiologist than I am? We're all just mortals. It's all pretty much the same, right? So Sharon should shut up and sit down and let the rest of us deliver anesthesia to the patient. Because all of us suck compared to God. So therefore, who are we to say that it matters that Sharon's had an entire lifetime of experience? That's a drop in the bucket compared to God's wisdom. So you see the problems that are being launched right out of the get-go here. This problematic notion that it's futile to try and it's pointless to discriminate has been linked up with how awful it is that people use differentials of power and money to oppress each other. They've been linked together into a single idea. And I'm going to call on Arya in just a second, but one way that you can think about this is that this is always what happens when you try to do arithmetic with infinity. Right? I can answer the question, what's 4 minus 1? What's 4 minus 2? What's 4 minus 3? What's 4 minus 4? What happens when I try to answer the question, what's 4 minus infinity? Well, in basic arithmetic, it's an error. You're not supposed to do that. Infinity doesn't mix well. The same comes from multiplication. The same comes from division. Anytime you start comparing things and distinguishing things, if you chuck an infinity, like God is all good and all powerful and all knowing, you chuck an infinity into your equations and all your equations fail and collapse. It breaks your math. The study of infinity is a separate branch of mathematics. A lot of work goes into investigation of the nature of infinity. But one of the conclusions one can reach is infinity is awfully inconvenient if you're trying to figure out the number of tiles in your living room and you're counting the length and the width of your room. It's not a good time to throw infinity into the middle of the equation anywhere. It's going to wreck your ability to tile your room. It's an impractical number. But in the theology that's being introduced as part of the persuasiveness, as trying to persuade the ancients to give up the ancient worldview and adopt the emerging new medieval worldview, infinity is everywhere, because the new God is an infinite God. He's infinite in multiple ways, and it causes overreach in the people making the arguments, and so you get this mix of the positive and the negative in these critiques right out of the gate. Ari, come off mute. Tell us what's on your mind.
Thank you so much, Rick. It's lovely to be here. Highlight of the week. I wanted to playfully pick on Sharon, the anesthesiologist in your model. It was beautiful that I had a thought that not only is, let's say she's, I'm not an anesthesiologist and she is, not only is my expertise as valid as hers, I feel like it's more insidious that if she's in the fold of the hierarchy of God, then her anesthesiology is somehow valuable, but it's not her own expertise. It's some sort of miracle from God. It falls into the God-man hierarchy, so it's valid. But as soon as it's semi-independent, it's much worse. It's not that she's the same as me. It's now that she's demonized as a witch, right? It's that her expertise. So it's like, and it's very interesting because if she's an anesthesiologist for the church, which is maybe a later part of the medieval era, but if she's under this hierarchy of God and falling into the integrative model of this is the only hierarchy between God and man, then she's gold. She's some sort of she's like a priest or something, right? She's some sort of miracle worker, but if she's outside of it, then she's a demon that needs to be destroyed and burned. And so it's not entirely about the expertise versus lack of expertise or the hierarchy versus lack of hierarchy. It's does it fall into our only version of the hierarchy, which is the God-man hierarchy, or does it fall outside of that, which means it's completely evil? And then it creates this sort of dualism of good versus evil, that if you're in it, then you're fantastic and you can do no wrong and you're a saint. And if you're outside of it, it's totally outside of that. And I don't know. You also triggered something. You were talking about infinity. This is my bread and butter. I study the nature of infinities. There's two things. There's basically, to break it down, there's countable infinities and there's uncountable infinities. And the nature of infinity is a very loaded word. In general, that any infinity is an actual finite amount. It exists. If you were to take a snapshot and spend all of eternity counting it, there would be an amount. And that there is no non-countable infinity. It's just more for our perspective. There are uncountable infinities, which are often seen as nonlinear or complex, that more like every time you count something, a new thing pops up, so you can't count it. But there are many in modern times with lots of math and how physics does. There's so many tricks, basically calculus, that gets you to count certain types of countable infinities. And this is the basis of modern set theory and information theory, that you can discern between, and not to go into a whole crazy thing about it, but it's that infinity itself is not a single, simple, reducible idea. It's very nuanced and complicated. And I think to make an overly reduced but yet reasonable dichotomy of it is that there are uncountable infinities, which are just complex and always changing, and almost like Heidegger's like Dasein. There's just always, everything's connected and everything's always changing. So anytime you try to count something, everything's already changed by the time you're done counting. So, but there is stuff there, you just can't count it. But then there are other things which are naturally forming sets, which you can count, and you can use tricks or tools to sort of count them. So that's what I wanted to say.
Yeah, you're right on, Ari. Thank you for that. Yeah, I was one of the kids who learned math under the new math, and I guess I'm told that parents all over America detested the new math, but I loved it. It was, the set theory made a lot of sense. You know,
I love new math. I teach my kids new math. Yeah.
Yeah. Here, this set has 3 apples. This set has 2 apples. Put the sets together. Count the apples. How many do you think will result? I mean, it was really an intuitive way to get started on arithmetic. I loved it. My dad's a mathematician, and countable and uncountable infinities incredibly important. And of course, the other nuance we can add to that that's helpful is, even aside from infinities, there's practical numbers and impractical numbers, and numbers that are too big for human beings to understand or have any intuition about are things that we tend to do badly with. Even, and this is where you sort of get the Hannah Arendt's introduction to the human condition, where she talks about the things that we can do, but we can't understand them and we can't put them into words, even though we can do them. Which is like, what happens when you can't think through the consequences of your actions? When you routinely do things that are so big and complicated that we have no intuition to understand them. And quantum physics is a good area like that.
Yeah. I think the best example of this, you'd say, we might agree, is that it's actually not Stalin's quote, but he uses it, is that one death is a tragedy, but a million deaths is a statistic, right? We can't relate to a million deaths, even though that's vastly more tragic. It's not intuitive to process. But if you saw a single mountain of bones, like you do in the bone fields in the East, in the Ostafront of World War II, that's still there, there's like miles and miles of bones. If you were to go and see that, it does have an intuitive, tragic experience. So,
because then you're confronting it on a human level in a concrete, tangible way that we can relate to.
Yeah.
So this stuff, there's gradations for sure, and I appreciate you introducing that. Hey, Joe, come off mute. Tell us what's on your mind.
Yeah, I mean, it's actually interesting to look at it from this perspective, the way you were actually just, talking about the distinction between, an oppressive hierarchy and one of expertise, and how the differentiation between those two. Because if you think about it in terms of how everybody being the same, it's actually in the differences that we actually find strength, right? So that you start to find respect for another person because they actually complement you, so that you start to recognize their strengths. But there also is this other aspect, the internal aspect, where there's this personal excellence, the idea of arete. That idea of doing something and doing it well is then lost, right? Because everything's the same. So it's not to say that humility isn't important. It's, as I think it's the last sentence there. It's the idea where he's talking about being humble in God's eyes, like the way, in order to be raised by God, you must be humble. But that creates, that creates, it's not necessarily it creates a perception that's not aligned with the reality. So far as, that if you're just acting humble and you don't really believe it, then you're actually suppressing, and it's a way of suppression at that point. And so it's not to say that not that you ought not remain humble, because that would be different, but there's the Aristotelian kind of mean that you can kind of think about it in terms of pride and humility. And pride is on one side and humility is on the other. And that if you're too far on either end, that it's not necessarily aligned with the reality. So just being humble and just kind of getting to this place of humility is not necessarily something where you're using your judgment. And where you're not using your judgment, that's kind of where you're basically able to be controlled. And so that then, kind of sets the stage for people to come in and actually become a dictator, so to speak. So anyway, I think that there's a lot to unpack there, what it means psychologically when you start to kind of unpack what they're saying here is everybody being the same, because the beauty is actually found in the differences. And
Right.
so that, and it also helps you understand your limitations as well.
Yeah.
And we all have them. So anyway, it's a distortion of reality is a way of summing this all up.
Yes. Yes. Thank you for introducing that. There's a couple of things in what you're saying that I really want to underscore. And one of them is this idea of a hypocrisy that gets built in from the beginning. And hypocrisy is one of the major defining characteristics of the medieval epoch, but it's not one that they set out to create. It wasn't their goal to make a hypocritical system. They just did that. And part of the reason is that the core value system and ideology is in such conflict with nature and reality that the only way to publicly comply with this ideology is through an act of pretense. Right? I mean, you can't afford not to have any doctors. You can't just say, well, nobody should be better at anything, so we're not going to train anyone. You do that, and what happens is you start losing wars in the Crusades, and eventually you get fed up with it, and the kings and the clergy who are willing to let there be universities start to win battles for a change, and the ones that continue to stick with the hard line of we're all the same continue to lose battles. I mean, the Crusades were a huge wake up for Europe. We lost a lot of battles because we detested that pagan knowledge. It was the devil's work. Meanwhile, the Arabs are busy translating Aristotle and and Archimedes and the rest, and they're making ballistas and siege weaponry, and they're able to defeat situations that we aren't. And the way that Europe was able to eventually hold its own in the Crusades was that there was an enormous transformation in the power structure in Europe. And the people who were willing to let there be universities and let there be the study of the old knowledge, they rose to power. But they had to do it while pretending that they weren't doing it. This is it's a miracle. It's God's grace. It's not me. Anyone who has worked hard to become the best they can at what they do knows that as part of what drives you is taking pleasure in doing better tomorrow than you did yesterday, taking pleasure in learning new things. And if you don't have that taking pleasure, you're never going to be able to egg yourself on through lesson after lesson after lesson, mistake after mistake after mistake that you make in the process of learning. You need that drive to push you through. And so what it means is that the people who are becoming better, even during the peak of this ideology we're describing, they have that drive, but they either just pretend to others that they don't, or they pretend to others by lying to themselves and claiming that they don't. And that encourages people to have a schism inside themselves, where they've got a brand, which is the official correct version of themselves, and then their actual character is suppressed and hidden inside. And the character has to be different from what the brand is, because if the brand was their character, they never could have had those accomplishments. They never would have persevered. They wouldn't have pushed the boulder up the hill, So it's interesting. This kind of discrepancy between how things are and how we say they are. The brand thing. It's not that the medieval epoch invented it. I mean, Roman emperors were doing that for centuries, right? Totally. Here's our Roman brand, Pax Romana. Even if what we really want is to conquer more places and take their stuff, we're still gonna talk about peace relentlessly. But at least in Roman society, it could be the case that it was only the power structure that had the brand, and thus the hypocrisy. The ordinary people could be pretty straightforward about how things are with each other. They could recognize what was reality. as long as they were careful who they said it to. But the medieval epoch wants to get all the way down into your soul. They're not concerned with the outward surface. They want to know that you've actually converted. That's why Torquemada later at the end of this period is torturing people. He wants to put them under duress to penetrate the brand to find out what the real character of the person is. So this is a totalitarian approach to hypocrisy. You have to believe all the way down to the bottom of your soul, or else you're going to hell, right? And so the hypocrisy stops being just something that's in the ruling class as a method of ruling people, and it starts becoming something that every single individual has to put inside themselves. They have to believe to the core of their being, this is who I am, even if that's absolutely not who they are. They have to believe it, or they'll be tortured for all eternity in hell. And what that does to the human psyche, the kinds of diremptions it creates, it's fascinating. I didn't quite do justice to something that Ari said, and I want to emphasize that too, which is it's true, and it goes hand in hand with what Joe just said. It's true that on the one hand, they're promoting the brotherhood of man. And, it's a good argument. No, none of us is God. None of us is half a God. None of us is a tenth of a God. So really, we're all basically in the same boat by comparison with God. And so we should have some compassion for each other. There's kind of a Buddhist thing going on in there, right? We're all suffering together. And even the best of us isn't as good as we need to be to do justice to the problems we face. And it's true. That's the human condition, right? We do the best we can, but it's not enough. So on the one hand, this kind of flatland of equality is right on. It's got some serious merit to it. It's just that it's being paired with this idea of flattening the other hierarchies. And since that doesn't actually work as a way to organize the world, Ari's right that what's actually happening is that they're stomping out every higher value hierarchy except for one. So they're actually imposing a more totalitarian hierarchy than anyone ever did before. They're saying you can't have multiple hierarchies. Like you can't have a hierarchy of anesthesiologists and a hierarchy of lab techs and a hierarchy of pharmacists and a hierarchy of nurses. And, in a hospital medical environment, you have a lot of separate hierarchies because you've got separate areas of expertise. And that works. You get a forest instead of a single tree. And a forest is able to do a lot of things, as we find out every time we desperately need the attention of the medical system. It's like, yeah, we got a lot of experts here. And they're all allowed to pursue their own areas of expertise. It's a good thing. We need those multiple hierarchies. But the core precept of this orthodox version of Christianity that's rising to power under the Roman Empire is obsessed with monotheism and with polytheism as being the work of the devil that must be exterminated. There can't be any other religions. There can't even be any other versions of Christianity. There has to be just one, and it has to be in charge of everything. This is as I've used the term before, and I'm not using it loosely. This is genocide. It's genocide as a worldview. The belief is all other religions need to be exterminated. All other sources of value need to be exterminated. So I'm going to tell a short story to illustrate this, because there's, medievalism continues into the modern era. We're essentially neo-medievals. Even though we're a different epoch, a lot of the foundational issues of the medieval epoch are still with us. And I've told this story before, but I don't think everybody was here. And it goes like this. My friend Peter Adkison and a bunch of his friends made this collectible trading card game called Magic the Gathering. And it hit it big. And they became a multinational corporation. They started in their basement with their house triply mortgaged, and everybody on the edge of being homeless. And they hit it big. They were one of those classic success stories. And that's why I have the home that I do. My wife was their first employee, and so she's paid for a lot of work in medical informatics and for my career and for all this philosophy stuff I do. But he was raised religious. Peter was raised religious. He was raised as a Seventh-day Adventist, and even though he wasn't feeling very devout at the time that he was making Magic the Gathering, he didn't want to upset his friends and family that he grew up with. And so he said, well, one of the things that we should do is we should invite church leaders from all over America to weigh in on this collection of magic cards that we have and help us to figure out which are the offensive ones. And then we can maybe dial back the offensive ones and make it, more acceptable. And he was thinking that the things that they wouldn't like were the ones that, had black magic or it's the devil on it or what have you. And the ones that they would like were the healing magic, the good med, how to be good, how to take care of people. And he was astonished when religious leaders all over America reacted exactly backwards. But no, we're fine with the devil. That's good, right? We all believe in the devil. But you can't show magic that does good things. Only God is good. Jesus is the only source of good things. There's no other source. And if you try to pretend that you've got these, good witches and good wizards who are out there healing people, then you're threatening our monotheism by claiming that there's some source of goodness other than God. And, they didn't use the words, but it's basically, if we could, we'd burn you at the stake if you promote that. That's the evil idea. That's the idea that has to be done away with. Nothing but God. Only God. God is the only one source of all things that are good and powerful and true. And if you say anything else, you're some kind of devil worshiper. You don't need the devil. You can all be nice, sweet, good people. That's even worse. We'd rather the devil. We know what to do with him. But we can't have you having little boys and girls pretending to heal people. That's wicked. And that was one of the big moments in Peter's life when he broke with the church. He's like, he didn't say the words, but we had plenty of conversations afterwards. Like, you people are crazy. You're promoting evil because at least it's a clear enemy. And you're stamping out good because you think somebody might not believe in Jesus if somebody else heals somebody. It's like suddenly you can see that you're flashing back to the medieval epoch when people are rounding up wise women and men from the villages and murdering them because they helped a woman give birth. It's like, and only God should do those things. What you must be some kind of devil worshiper or a witch if you say those things. So there is a way in which the pursuit of monotheism can lead to, on the one hand, genocide comes right out of it, clearly. That's the goal, right? Is exterminate the other religions by conversion, by the sword, whatever. Different people have different tolerance levels for how you do it, but they all want to do it. But Ari's right. What comes out of this is a single hierarchy with God on top. And any other hierarchical structure has to be woven into that Christmas tree structure. God's on top and the rest of us are somewhere in between. So you have right off the bat a tension between we're all brothers and sisters under the Lord on the one hand, which could be very good, and on the other hand, well, somebody has to call the shots and make decisions, but we can't afford to have more than one of those hierarchies. So we're just going to have one hierarchy with one set of people calling the shots and making decisions. That is, by the time you get to the high Middle Ages, not the early stages, right? This isn't coming out of the gate, but by the time you get to the high Middle Ages, the 1100s, 1200s, 1300s, you've got the world divided into those who work, those who pray, and those who fight. That's the threefold division of medieval society in Europe. And it's a hierarchy. Those who work are on the bottom. But at the same time that they're saying God wants you to insert yourself into this hierarchy and be at the bottom and labor for those who fight and those who pray, they're also saying the hierarchy isn't there at all and we're all brothers and sisters under God. So what Joe's talking about, this hypocrisy that goes right into your brain, is there. You have to believe, on the one hand, that you have to obey your Lord and obey the clergy, while at the same time believing that they're not above you and you're all the same. This isn't good for the brain, right? Because they aren't both true. But you have to believe they're both true. So all of that's buried in that first sentence. This is how Kenneth writes, right? There is a lot of stuff being said in that. Not least of which is, struggling to make accomplishments in the classical world is the highest of all values, right? Try to do better tomorrow than you did yesterday. That's the core value system of the ancient world. And now they're saying, what are you, the devil? You think you're another god? You think you're better than other people? Forget it. Go ahead, Joe.
I was just going to say really quickly, it's interesting because you can almost see the schism in a way, the way actually people, outside of the religious context of how people project what they project on like social media and what they are and how that schism is actually problematic, like from a psychological standpoint, right? And so that there's that, now looking at it from a different perspective, that how problematic that can be. Anyway, it's just a thought.
Yeah. Thanks, Joe. Phil, come off mute. Tell us what's on your mind. And by the way, Welcome back, Phil. I'm sorry you had trouble with the internet a couple weeks ago.
Well, I was thinking about the relationship of the infinities, the countable infinities, and the uncountable infinities. I'm thinking like that in a way was the contradiction in Rome between the leftovers of the Greco-Roman culture. In other words, even though it's debased, there's still a belief in some kind of internal hierarchy in a sense. Certainly, you you have generals, you have other corporals, and then you have. I mean, so there's absolutely a hierarchy, if nothing else, in that sense, because you wouldn't say everybody's the same. It almost seems to me like if you go back to the classical age, even the gods were not infinite. They were very, very strong because they reflected nature, and nature is very big, but it's not infinite as well in a funny way. And I'm thinking if the contradiction between the two is a measurability of human endeavors versus its relationship to the infinite, unmeasurable relationship between God, this kind of God, the infinite, the truly infinite God, uncountable infinity God, and everybody else. When you look at it that way, that infinity is uncountable. Human beings is not organized like a Christmas tree. It's flat. In fact, it's so flat that it's practically zero. There's God, and there's zero. I mean, talk about being and nothingness. I mean, God is being, and human beings are, if anything, very close to zero, but not absolute zero. I mean, that's an incredible reduction in terms of understanding how society, how human beings would be. And so that seems like how how those two concepts, even though the base Greco-Roman culture, and in contrast to the the Augustan divine God relationship, how they could coexist, it's kind of a miracle. I mean, how the hell did that even survive? Because it did coexist in its own way. And my thought, I also had this discussion with I had this question with this guy who was he was an expert in Heidegger. He was also a very, very skilled mathematician. So somebody mentioned, well, like, seems to me Hegel has an infinity, and he kind of laughed, chuckled a little bit. He said, well, yeah, but that's a kind of small infinity. So, in other words, it's not the infinity, the grand infinity. And so I asked him the question. I said, well, if Hegel was talking about the development of culture, civilization, as evolution, then it seems to me society is organized in a social structure, relationships, and it seems to me governments are always there to mediate. And so he's talking about the evolution of social political dynamic, and it passes down, evolves, okay. And in that sense, the kind of infinity that Hegel had, since it's so bound to government work, I said, isn't that good enough for government work? he kind of laughed. He knew he knew there was a kind of funny joke in a relationship. I mean, it is good enough for, and I wish we had a government that understand that kind of infinity better, not the absolute infinity in which there's being, which is God, and there's nothingness, which is us, because we have to live in existence as well. And the problem is existence is not nothing. Well, it might be nothing, I guess, when you die, I mean, even the Buddha said, you know, of course, he always wanted to go to nirvana because he wanted to escape this ever turning cycle of suffering. But at some point, the Buddha said something very mysterious. He said, samsara is nirvana. I mean, talk about a contradiction in a funny way, but it's really true. He really believed that no, instead of like wanting to escape it in some sense, you're lucky to be given a life of suffering so you can experience all the good stuff as well. So 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 I just want to say that. I mean, it does seem like the absolute infinity is hard to comprehend. I guess if you really believe in it, then you would have to submit yourself to being in the not only the flatlands, but kind of underground. That's it, Phil.
Thank you, Phil. Sharon, tell us what's on your mind.
Nothing as complex as that. I just want to take us back to the text, right? I just want to take us back to the text and the very first page where we're pouring the new wine into the wineskins. And what we're learning as we're going along here is that new wine is very is controversial and subject to interpretation. And if we go back to the paragraph that you outlined that we're going to read today, it says, for Christianity leveled all human and social accomplishments to the same debilitating futility and meaninglessness. Vanity of vanities and the morose Ecclesiastes of the Old Testament, all is vanity. Now, those first two sentences, it's not my impression that Christianity leveled all human and social accomplishments to the same debilitating futility and meaningless. Because right after Solomon wrote Ecclesiastes, he turned around and wrote a very uplifting book called Proverbs, right? And this was an extremely wealthy man, had 700 concubines, and life was meaningless for him at that point until he engaged a different ideology.
Yes.
And it says, all the high human values of antiquity were disparaged witheringly by Christ. If a man desired to be first, the same shall be last of all. The same shall be last of all and the servant of all. Whoever seeks to be the first in the eyes of men shall be made last in the eyes of God. Seek instead to be humble, and you might be raised by God. For all that is worldly is temporal, the evanescent issue of the day. But there's another part in the Bible that says, for God has not given you a spirit of fear, but of power and love and self-discipline.
Right.
So what I'd be interested to see is what are the core concepts of this very convoluted, evolving Christian ideology will be adopted as the medieval times defines itself.
Yes.
And I think, as with all scriptural texts, it is very confusing and open to interpretation.
Yes. This is, anytime your core text grows beyond a certain point, it's going to have more and more contradictions in it. It doesn't, even in the scientific text, right? I mean, it is the nature of complexity, as Gödel talks about. The more complex your description of things, the more you're going to have hits and misses along the way. But also, there's that issue of, in a complex world, for one set of problems, you might need to adopt a strategy, but then for a different set of problems, you might even have to adopt the opposite strategy in order to pursue the same goal. It's the results of dealing with a complicated world. So there's a lot of different messages in this text that were meant for different contexts. But the problem is you've got generations of theologians and political thinkers who are applying this text not based on what was the intent of the person who wrote it and what was the exact situation they faced, but how do I get these people today to do what I need them to do? Which is, an issue you've raised before, and I think you're right on, which is what happens when the text starts being wielded as a hammer, to accomplish today's goal,
Well, I think that the Roman adoption of Christianity, in my impression, was a hammer. It wanted conformity from its citizens. Yes. So the nuance effect of goodness and kindness and love kind of fell by the way. It was all about control.
Right.
And the Catholic Church complied with that. It was all about control. And so that became the evolution of the Middle Ages. Even in today's world, among the Christian faith, God knows how many denominations we have, but everybody else sees central issues, core issues very differently.
That's right. That's
And
right.
so it's that is part of the practice of Christianity. And that's why in my book, it's your own internal faith in actuality.
Yes. Yeah. I mean, the issue, the initial issue you introduced on this is a particularly good one. That on the one hand, you've got parts of this text that are saying, don't be so proud as to think that you can be a better runner than somebody else. Don't strive, don't try. And on the other hand, you've got other parts of the text that are saying the opposite. God has given you a gift, and he doesn't want you to hide it. Go forth and make of it what you can. Do good in the world with what you have available to you. That is another message that's being given, but it's being given in different passages in different parts of the Bible. And what's happening in the arguments is when they're trying to convince the old world that it's wrong and that it has done wrong and its belief system is wrong, they don't bring out the stuff about God has given you different gifts and you should use them. They bring out the stuff about don't be so proud, right? Because they're trying to tear down an existing power structure.
That's the control.
Yeah. But then, they're having a conversation with their brethren and saying, okay, we need to try to make some change in the world. They're not telling them, but give up because it's all futile, right? Then they bring out the other passage that says, no, you can trust in God. God's given you gifts. You can use them, to make the world a better place. So don't be passive, be active, take care of your neighbor and take care of each other. You're getting these contradictory messages.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't want to, so given that is a natural outcome of dealing with a complicated situation, you've got to have different strategies for different situations. I don't want to demonize them too much on this point, because the old world had to go. The late Roman Empire was awful. It was just awful. It was not a good place. And we needed to move on from that. But there's consequences. When you bake this stuff in and you say it's an orthodoxy, it's different from when it's like in medicine, you might adopt a different situation for a different patient because they've got a different set of conditions, but you don't enforce it as an orthodoxy. You're taught to keep your mind alive to the nuances of the situation, and that your goal is to wield your science and your experience to do the best you can for the patient in front of you, whatever they need. The problem comes when it gets turned into a tool of empire and it becomes a kind of orthodoxy that's jammed down on everybody regardless of the situation that they're in. So there's this tug of war going on in the soul of the religion. The other thing I kind of want to emphasize too is that what he's talking about here is the very beginnings of Christianity, not Jesus's time, but the next couple of centuries, and the what they were emphasizing then, the challenges that they faced then, they're not binding upon the possibilities of Christianity today, right? I mean, it's 2,000 years of development of this religion. So, we'll see a lot of, especially in the months ahead, when we start to crack open specific texts by specific early church fathers and mothers. We'll see places where they say things that are out of sync with the parts of the orthodoxy we don't like. There's places where they're saying things we really admire, even if that didn't become the dominant strain of the main religion. It's still present as a life-giving vein of theology within the overall movement. So
Well, I saw the adoption of Christianity as a tool. Let's see where it gets weaponized as they adopt the ideology.
Yes,
that's the question I have. That's the thinking I have in my mind.
Yeah, I'm with you. Thanks, Sharon. Donald, what's on your mind?
Well, a sentence in the text, especially for Sharon. Let's see. About halfway through the paragraph, 12 here. Men cannot look to other men for their ultimate standards of what is good or right. That's Hegel, not Hegel, it's Smith, Kenneth, summarizing the Christian perspective. But I guess that means in some ways they're not existentialist. So maybe they are, I mean, this this is, as you pointed out, certainly is contra to the classic Greek culture of agon, which is precisely where we learn by comparing ourselves to other men, not just what is good or right, but how skillful we are at many other things. And then later on, almost, I guess in the last sentence, on to this sentence, how many times when we were looking at the Greeks did we go back to Aristotle in the Nicomachean Ethics about you got to find somebody. That's exactly how you become good, is finding somebody that's better than you and following them around, finding an Aristos. Of course, the Romans would have been in the same position that we are today. There weren't any to follow, so you would have something. And then this last sentence, the first part, men in late antiquity needed a code that would enable them to live morally and spiritually in isolation and hostility. I kind of like that as a summary too, because that's kind of the way I read Plato and Aristotle. You know, they're writing past the peak of the Greek polis. What can men do after the polis has collapsed? There's some truth to the statement, I think, that you can't fully be good if you don't live in a good polis or good community, because you just won't have the support you need, and the roles that you would play wouldn't be open to you. But still, there's how good can I be in a bad situation? And that was certainly the guidance on how to do that is in Plato and Aristotle. And that it's a task that not only did people in the late after Greek civilization, in Hellenistic civilization or Roman civilization had, and I think many would say we have today, that we live within a civilization or society that it's not supportive of us trying to live morally. I don't know, but I am a bit. I guess I would like, Rick, if you would say a bit more about what are the Christians are not existentialist, and maybe that's why they introduced spirit. That, you know, we have an essence known to us from the very beginning, not one learned from competition with other people. Well, enough.
That's great stuff, Donald. Yeah, that's fantastic. There's a, and I want to kind of run with that a bit, because I think it also plays into what Sharon was asking about. You know, there's a way in which, when you're living in a highly corrupt period of time, you can't be authentic. You can't just be open with everybody about who and what you are, because you don't want to be corrupt. So you don't want to go with the times. You don't want to fit in. But if you stick out too much, you'll be the nail that gets hammered down. So there becomes this, the hypocrisy that we were talking about, a few minutes ago. There are authentic reasons why it's important to separate your brand from your character, because you need a brand that's going to ensure you won't get slaughtered. You got to be able to fit in. And if you don't have that brand, you're going to be one of those victims people point to and say, see what happens when you don't have a good brand? Fix your brand, buddy. You gotta make sure you look right. And when in Rome, do as the Romans do. But you also can't capitulate to that because you're so out of sync with it. You're like, I can't be the person they want me to be. So the solution is, again, I got to go back to my Okinawan Japanese karate notes and find the terms for this. But in Japan, it's really clear. They've got a whole term for the part of yourself that you show to others. They've got a word for that. And it doesn't have to be done out of cruelty or deceit or to con people or anything else. You can have very good reasons to want to have an image of yourself that's different. In fact, not only can you have to. I mean, because, a certain amount of the time you're taking a shower or taking a poop or, picking your nose, and you don't need to push that in everybody's faces out of some kind of adolescent desire to be 100% authentic at all times. You can say, how about if the less pleasant parts of myself, I take care of those privately, and then I bring you more pleasant parts of myself so we can all have more fun with each other. It's not that we can't ever be real with each other, but it's just not going to be a relentless parade of, butt wiping. There's our social interactions can be more than that. We can aspire to, to filter a little bit. And so the Japanese concept, it builds all that in as an idea that there is a separation there. For privacy is part of what makes social interactions work, that you create a separation between your outward persona and your inward character. So there are good reasons to do it and bad reasons to do it. And it only becomes a problem if you're doing it and you don't know you're doing it. If you're doing it and you don't know you're doing it, that's when you get schizoid internally and you start to not know yourself. And now you're violating the core ancient ethos, right? Because you don't know who and what you are. You're living a lie. So you can see why the medieval epoch would have a problem with hypocrisy, since the only way that it could grow up inside of the rotting Roman Empire is by separating the internal and the external. If they didn't do that, they couldn't do any of the good things. To do the good things, they had to put up the mask. We're mostly good Roman citizens. There may be a few things we won't budge on, like we're not going to worship your emperor, but in every other way, we're going to try to be good so that you won't pick on us any more than necessary. And that means we're not going to tell you everything about ourselves. So there is this, what is the saying? Begin as you mean to go on. And in the dojo, they say, practice in the dojo exactly the way you want to do it out on the streets. Don't think that you can practice one way and then turn on a dime later when you're under pressure and behave differently than that. You gotta practice for the real thing, because it's too hard not to be authentic. And so anytime you do this kind of a separation of who you really are from how you appear, you create problems for yourself. And as Donald pointed out, one of the problems is if you want to be a good anesthesiologist, you're going to have to find, and you're young and you're just starting out, you're going to have to find good anesthesiologists. And if society says anesthesia is evil and bad and we're trying to exterminate it, you're going to have a lot of trouble finding those good anesthesiologists. And if you do find them, you're going to have to be pretending not to follow them around just in case they get in trouble, while actually following them around so that you can learn from them. These connections between people that allow intergenerational transmission of expertise and talent and value systems, it's very difficult when society frowns on those things and tries to rupture them and break them apart. It creates very difficult circumstances for the generation of expertise and goodness. And that's what he's talking about here in sentences 7 and 8. When you're living inside ruptured septic circumstances and you're trying to figure out, how can I try to learn to be a good person when this is my context? It's a tough challenge. So I guess my answer would be the transcendentalism is a natural inversion to have happened from the ancient world to the medieval world, because they had to transcend their circumstances, which were so oppressive and totalitarian. They had to get out. And if they couldn't get out physically, then they had to get out spiritually. There had to be some escape somehow. And again, that became momentum. Even when the Roman Empire fell, the momentum of centuries of growing up that way, you don't just turn on a dime and then suddenly become existentialists now that you don't have the Roman Empire on top of you. It's like, yeah, but you've been doing this for centuries now. I mean, there's a lot invested in these core strategies, even if they're no longer necessary. And this is one of the things they talk about a lot. Anybody who grew up in abusive home dynamics or addictive home dynamics or what have you, as a child, you learn coping strategies and survival strategies that your life depends on. And your problem as an adult is you're out of those circumstances, but you've spent so long practicing those strategies, you're good at them. And so you keep using them even when they don't apply anymore. It's very, very hard to change gears after you leave home. It's part of why a lot of people who've been abused as a child seek out an abuser for a spouse. It just, all of your instincts about how to survive mesh nicely with this problematic person. It's an unconscious thing that happens. So this new epoch is getting started under these difficult circumstances, and after the circumstances are shed, it's already got all these coping strategies just baked into the character of the worldview in the epoch, and it carries them along with and keeps doing them. It's a great point about transcendental versus existential, Don. Thank you. Phil, come off mute. Tell us what's on your mind.
Yeah, I think what's on my mind is to expand on what maybe I shouldn't say expand, but to comment on what Sharon said, and maybe to a certain degree what Donald said. Now, I was absent to part of Sharon's discussion with you because the postman was knocking at the door, and I don't want the postman to be always ringing twice. And so I missed part of it, but I got the gist of it in this sense. She wanted to ask what are the consequences that are left over from the Roman Empire, the duality of the Roman Empire between, on the one hand, the existential part, and on the other hand, the transcendental part. And that's clearly manifested, certainly at colonialism. You know, when the Spanish, particularly the Spanish, I guess the Portuguese as well, well, actually, the English and the French too, but slightly in a different way. You know, when Cortez, you know, Pizarro, they went in, and of course, there was a physical manifestation, military power. It was about power, okay? And they decimated these cultures, but they also brought along the priests. About that spiritual power, right? And what the spiritual power is given justification for the manifestation of existential power, military power. Because these people were not only heathens, okay? I'll put that in quotes because I don't want to say that. That was my word. Not only heathens, but they were, what do you call, you know, they were also, the words coming to my mind, but somebody who's against a religion. What do you call that? There's a term that they're out of line. I mean, it's like
Heretics, blasphemers.
Heretics. They were also heretics. And you know what we do with heretics? We burn them at the stake. You know what I mean? Because they were just against whatever it is. So in some sense, that sort of spiritual dimension gives them a kind of moral right to exterminate people, or at least bring them in order, because you know they have to see things in the right way. So that seems to be manifest. Maybe that's been toned down now in the 20th and 21st century, but it's still there. So the Roman culture, the two states, the Roman culture, actually has lasted and really exists. And you know, what is it? You know, when they broke into even into the government, you know, what was that date again? Is it January 6th or something? when did that riot happen?
20
I
years
mean,
ago.
what?
No, you're right. You're right.
So in some sense, yeah, we still have that problem. It probably is not as bad as, when the Spanish just did their number in South America, and then also in part of Mexico, the Aztecs as well as the Incas. So, okay, I'll just say it there. There's
Thanks.
a manifestation of power in
Yeah,
both the physical and the metaphysical dimension.
it's good. Thank you. Yeah, it's interesting that when the founding fathers of the United States were trying to design their constitution, they looked back on all of the examples available to them and they said, "Ooh, this Roman one looks good." It's just like it is. If you're looking for evidence that the modern worldview and its value system are radically alien to the medieval worldview and its value system, look no further than the fact that we look at the Roman example and go, "Hey, that looks good." As you know, the medieval epoch is defined in opposition to the Roman value system and political economy. It's like that's the core of their argument is we're not Rome because it was so rotten and awful. But we're looking at Rome and going, that you call it rot, but I think it's piquant. That's tasty. I think we should totally do that. So we can't be surprised that we find those same strategies of divide and conquer and such deep nihilism and now are rife with corruption, right? Are the fruit of that tree we replanted, right? We basically work to recreate the conditions under a different value system. Anyway, here we are. Joe, come off mute. Tell us what's on your mind.
Yeah, it's just something that I actually put in the chat that I was actually going to bring up as well. It's kind of Kenneth's use of Ecclesiastes, kind of in the sense that, kind of looking at it as morose. And it depends on, and I put an article in the chat about it as well. And even going through other translations like the Robert Alter translation of Ecclesiastes, and there's also multiple other translations that I looked at, and it really does matter how you translate the word. And I think that the important part that I'm taking when I take away what Ecclesiastes is about how meaning is created. So I don't necessarily see it in the same light as kind of the way Kenneth is seeing it in that particular instance, is that you have to state what is meaningless in order to determine what is meaningful. And that's the journey of Ecclesiastes, in my opinion, is that you start to see what is actually meaningful, and even the statements in themselves clearly demonstrate that that things that are kind of material things in and of themselves are not sufficient. Now, with other people, they are. But I think that there is one thing that we do all share, and that is that, we will die. And so having that as kind of that unifying factor and understanding that as far as the meaningfulness aspects of life, I wouldn't lump it in with the Christian, the Christian leveled all humanity as social accomplishments as debilitating and futile and meaningless. I think they're very different. So I would, maybe I'd just reevaluate that, at least based on the translation. So anyway.
That is a great point, Joe. And thanks for not just putting it in the chat, but actually talking to us about it. It's an important point. And part of what you can see at work in this is the difference between Ecclesiastes in Hebrew versus Ecclesiastes in Latin or Greek or English.
Right.
It's like, you look at Cicero struggling to translate Greek into Latin. Like he coined the equation. We know it was Cicero because he said so. He talked about it. He coined the equation of the Latin word natura with the Greek word physis. And we've talked before about how natura means having been born. It's the past participle. And that there's some wisdom there. There's some important things to be seen in that being your definition of the natural world. But you lose a lot by losing the becoming, the present participle, of the Greek word for nature. And what you lose is so important that it's really a completely different concept.
Right.
They can't be equated. You see the same thing going from arete to virtu. Arete, we've talked a lot about this rich concept and what it means, the pursuit of excellence that makes it possible for you to live a way of life that works and blah, 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 versus virtu, which is the manliness, the strength to let you dominate a situation. It's like one of them means might makes right, and the other
Right.
one has to do with the diversity of strategies that living things follow to try to work their way into the ecosystems in a sustainable way. These are completely alien concepts, and they're not trying to do something as difficult as translate from Hebrew to English, right? They're both Indo-European languages. They're both, highly inflected languages, and yet you can't get the concepts across from one to the other without doing real damage to the ideas. So it's not surprising that when we take, the vanity, so we take hevel out of Hebrew and we turn it into English vanity, which is kind of diluted from vanitas from Latin, we've really changed the word. It means completely different things to the modern reader.
Yeah, and I mean, and that's just actually the one of the translations that that I read actually speaks exactly to that.
Yeah.
So I mean, that distinction that you just made between the Latin translation versus Hebrew.
Yeah. Well, not surprising. I've got a whole bookshelf full of Robert Alter's translations. I can see it from here. So I was thrilled. Hey, Joe, thank you.
Yeah. You can see, yeah. It's
So-
I see Sharon wants to add something.
Yes, I just want to add something to what Joe said. I really want to support it because Ecclesiastes starts out very morose, chapter 1. He probably was really having a very serious depressive day that day. But by the time he gets to chapter 3, he said, to everything there is a season. And that for me is one of the most beautiful passages. I mean, that I read that at my mother's funeral. There's a time for everything. And it kind of starts, and chapter 3, and I'm not a theological student, but chapter 3 onwards start to put little seeds of hope into that book until we get to Proverbs. So translation aside, I think Kenneth Smith using this one sentence is kind of Jesus picking one sentence out of the first chapter in Ecclesiastes, which is just pretty morose. So I support what you said, Joe. Translation aside, the book changes as it goes along.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, yeah, thank you for sharing that. It's really important. Thank you for sharing that. And I think I'd also like to underscore, I'm going to call on Ari in a second, and he's going to have a lot to say about this. But here again, we run into the evidence that the term Judeo-Christian is even more problematic than the term Greco-Roman, but they're both problematic. Greek and Roman are not at all the same. The languages are different, the philosophies are different, the worldviews are different. But it's also true with Judeo-Christian. The Jewish worldview and the Christian worldview are not at all the same. And the way that they use language is very different, in part because so many people in the early Christian era didn't speak Hebrew anymore. Many of them were Romanized Christians, or Hellenized Christians. They spoke Greek or Latin. And for some of them, Hebrew was a second language, and for a lot of them, Hebrew wasn't a language they spoke at all. They sort of listened to it in the synagogue the same way that so many medieval people listened to priests intoning in Latin, not really knowing what they're talking about. The rhythms are familiar, the sounds are familiar, and their neighbor tells them what it means, and they go, "Oh, okay, so that's what it means." But they have no idea, right? If that's actually the same term or not. So you've got language problems between Jews and Christians, but you've also got conceptual problems. We'll come to this point repeatedly over the next 2 years, because for the Jews, the Jewish books are books in and of themselves about what they're about. But for the early Christians believed that they had a decoder ring that told them that the Jews were wrong about what the Jewish books meant, and that all of the Jewish books are actually about Jesus. And you can see this in the Gospels. the Gospels are written in a way that illustrates what the preoccupation of the early Christians was, which is, okay, so David comes into the city and he's riding, a donkey backwards, and people are laying palm branches, and you Jews were mistaken to think that that's about David. It's actually about Jesus. So they really point out when Jesus is entering a city on a donkey backwards and there's palm branches, say, see, this is actually a prophecy of Jesus. It's not actually about David. And the Gospels say this over and over and over. This part of this Jewish passage isn't really about David. This part's not about Solomon. This part's not about Isaiah. None of these things are about what they say they are. They're actually a puzzle, and it's all arrows pointing to Jesus, and that's all any of that is. It's just saying Jesus is the real God and He's coming. And so really, your book isn't your book; it's our book, because you don't know how to read it, and we do. They made this argument not only implicitly, but they make it explicitly. There are a lot of early church writings where they just come out and say, the Jews didn't know what to do with their book, but we do. So it's actually our book. So even if they have, for the ones who do read Hebrew, the early church fathers, they're not reading it the way that the Jewish people are reading it. They're not reading it as being about what it's about. They're looking for evidence that these early people are prophesying Jesus as the real God who's going to come and replace all of the old problems. And if that's how you approach a text, it's going to really hinder your ability to hear what the author's trying to say, because that's not what no Jew believes that those books all exist in order to prophesy Jesus, right? I mean, the authors did not think, I'm going to sit down a book of prophecy that proves that Jesus is coming. That's not what these authors were thinking about. But that's the way that the early church fathers are reading them. So I'm saying, on the one hand, you've got a language barrier, and on the other hand, you've got an ideological barrier that makes it so that even if language weren't a barrier, they still wouldn't be able to read it the way it was meant to be written. And it's the advantage that comes later on when we're not concerned. Christians today aren't concerned with how am I going to persuade the members of the Roman Empire to convert. I mean, that happened thousands of years ago. That's a dead issue now. So we can try to actually read books like Ecclesiastes the way that they were meant to be read, which is a freedom that the early church fathers didn't have. They were trapped by their immediate goals. Ari, come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
Let's see. Hold on. Trying to come off mute. Unmute. There we go. Sorry, having a little trouble with that. Thanks so much. I'm riled up. This is good stuff. I'm inspired mostly by the fact that I've actually studied some of this for the first time in the last year or so, more in depth, from my favorite Jewish scholar, Rabbi Jonathan Sachs of blessed memory. He was the chief rabbi of Great Britain, and to me, I'm a little bit clearly biased here, but I think he's one of the greatest scholars that's ever lived. His scholarship of Greek knowledge. I mean, he's a Cambridge educated rabbi, which I don't think has ever happened. And his knowledge of Jewish scholarship and Greek and just so many different things. And he believed in the dignity, what he called the dignity of difference, and knowing all these different things. Long story short, he has a wonderful depiction of Ecclesiastes that's to some degree almost heretical, in the sense that it doesn't follow much of what we call a traditional scholarship of the Jewish interpretation, but his linguistics for the translations is just unparalleled. And there's two words I want to give a tiny little sine qua non masterclass according to what he would say about him, in this case about Ecclesiastes. And it's this idea, it's very much what Joe was saying, that it goes from a statement of meaninglessness to telling us what meaning is. And it's not a complete version of meaning. It's just a very simple, nice idea. And it goes from this idea of hevel, which you guys translated very traditionally as vanity or futility. But the actual word is related to the word of Cain and Hevel. The first two, Cain killed Abel. Hevel is the Hebrew word of what we call Abel. And what this was is like all of the Jewish words for a soul or a living being, they're related to breath. They're related to breathing. Like God breathed in, the soul into a man. This is all breathing. And so Hevel refers to a shallow breath. And makes sense that all life is a shallow breath. You're here for but a moment, and that anything you do is foolishness because you're just a shallow breath. and this relates to this idea that humans are trying to foolishly attain certainty or immortality, and yet the meaning of life is to embrace the uncertainty and the smallness of ourself. And to some degree, it's much more of a almost Buddhist or modern meditative approach to, like Alan Watts would say, is getting away from words and him having the answers to the power of presence. And that reality, you cannot just say what reality is in words, because reality is not words. Reality is more than words. And specifically, there's a word that reflects this sort of experiential perspective of where you derive meaning and therefore happiness. And it's the word simcha. In Ecclesiastes, they use this word simcha 17 times. Yes, comparatively to the other texts, like in the Old Testament, specifically the Pentateuch of the 5 Bibles, this word simcha is used once in the first 4 books, and then maybe a few times in the 5th book. And simcha is, to some degree, what we call, like, if you're going to a really nice, like a wedding is called a simcha, or a birth of a baby is a simcha. And these are specifically social forms of happiness. Similarly, there was a thing called the second tithes, where you would give your taxes to some degree, but this is different. You don't give it to a specific group of people. You would take it to Jerusalem, the holy city, and you would have to take whatever portion, it's 10% of what you earned, and you'd have to literally spend it on this experience in Jerusalem. And the idea was, Moses Maimonides says that this was people basically bringing their vast wealth to the city, and then they would share it with everyone. Because it's like, you can't, if you're a wealthy person and you have 10% of your stuff, this essentially becomes a huge amount of wealth that you can't spend in this short amount of time, like a festival. And you essentially have to give it away to a lot of people. And it creates these like amazing parties. And this is the idea of simcha, is joy in the specific type of happiness refers to a shared happiness, an otherness, what Viktor Frankl would call how the happiness, the door to happiness swings outwardly. And that when we're really finding meaning, it's connecting to others and sharing with others. And this is where he uses the word simcha 17 times to represent what is meaningful, that when you're doing things for yourself, and there's another strange language in Ecclesiastes that's lost because it's Hebrew, is there's this word, like you would say, whenever you'd say a word, you'd say an E at the end to represent the self, or like Anochi means I, but then you could also add another word afterwards, which means li, which means me. And there's many doublets in Ecclesiastes that goes I and me, and it's just reflected in this hyper individualistic over focus on self. And that's where you have Hevel, where you have this me, all the things I do, all the things I have, all the, all of the pleasures that he has, all of the things he knows. It's all about what he has. But when he talks about simcha, it's basically focusing outwards towards others and connection towards others. And of course, the idea is to God itself, but in a simple sense, that when you're directed outwardly towards others, you get simcha. And that's the definition in Hebrew of happiness as a joyful experience shared with others. Like it says, when a man is in the one of the famous things, it says when a man first marries a wife, he should be samachta to his wife for the first year, and he's not obligated to go to war, which means he needs to bring joy to his wife. And this is this idea of it's an action, it's a verb. It's not joy as a noun, it's joy as a verb, and it's the specific verb of like being with other people and sharing what you have with others in a fun, you got a big party and you just want to throw it for everyone. And it's also with the power of the presence, meaning that this is not something like simcha is not looking back on your life and all the achievements you have, like the happiness you get from a life well achieved. This is in the moment of some sort of celebration that's happening now. So these are the two comparisons that I like to say, that Hevel is this idea of trying to acquire things, and then that's just a shallow breath that's meaningless, because all that we have is actually uncertain, and trying to achieve certainty is foolishness and wasteful. But when you embrace uncertainty through this idea of simcha and sharing with others, where you're connected to it, but you're not controlling it, then you achieve meaning.
That's fantastic, Ari. Thank you for that. If I was looking at the Wikipedia article and I see he's written a lot of books, so I don't know.
35 books.
If you could pick one out that focuses on this issue, we could put it in the chat and people could follow up. Because this
I
is
will try to do that. Of all things, that is difficult because a lot of his works are like a lot of Jewish stuff is lectures where he's speaking to people over and over. And so I listen to these,
in a video.
and he
Sure.
will. And
Yeah.
so most of these things, if you want to have the access to find it through, like you can just ask ChatGPT for the specific lectures. His big thing is called Covenant and Conversation, and he does a lot of BBC things where he's trying to talk to non-Jewish people about the idea that to be a good Jew means to is his one of his famous philosophies is that you should be true to your own self, whether it means you're true to your own faith or your integrity,
Hmm.
and be a blessing to others regardless of their faith. And
Hmm.
one of his books that really expresses this is called The Dignity of Difference. I love that book. That's a great book. But specifically about Ecclesiastes, he gives these in speeches and lectures. I don't know if he actually has a book. I'll have to
Okay.
look it up.
Oh,
I'll
YouTube
try to find
videos
a
work
book for that.
too.
Yeah.
Yeah, just for follow up because these are important ideas. It's very interesting. I had no
Yeah.
idea about these threads running through Ecclesiastes, but now that you pointed out, this
And the
is
last point I'd like to make is from what I understand, I study a lot of scholarship of Jewish stuff. I haven't really heard any other scholar point out that Hevel means a shallow breath in
yeah,
this clear way. They usually translate it as futility and pointless and whatnot. But apparently, if you look at the linguistic root of more of a scholarship point of view, it relates to like someone who's dying and can't really breathe very well.
I love this stuff. This is great. Thanks, Ari. Thanks very much.
Yeah,
I'm sure we're gonna come back to this repeatedly because this is a profound concept, this distinction.
yeah. It's very, thank you for letting me share. That was beautiful.
Of course, it's great. Sharon, come off mute. Tell us what's on your mind.
So by the time we get to the end of Ecclesiastes, we see that it's not such a terrible book after all, which is what I was saying. Well, can I take us back to the text?
Please.
Right? And I want to go to the next paragraph because it's something that you said, Rick, and to the middle of the paragraph, because I think that's the leading sentence. It said, that ethos of natural rank manifested itself in the prerogatives of the ancient gods as well. And it is here that Christianity's theological core shows mutant elements that they defied the comprehension of the ancient minds. And that's the confusion or the contradiction of the ideology that the ancients going into the medieval time was trying to adopt.
Yes. Yeah, it's the flattening effect between people, creating the strong difference between gods and men, the one God and men, went hand in hand with another set of arguments that were used in the proselytizing to say that what the ancients were worshiping weren't gods at all. Because if they don't rise to the level of the one God, why are you even calling them gods? They're obviously not. That's what a god is. These things are all inferior, so they're not gods. And there's a swap happening. There's a shift happening. If they're not really gods, then all of those prerogatives that are set aside for them don't belong to them. They belong to the one God, right? And so this combing apart of God and men is resulting in all of the ancient gods being demoted along the way, which is part of how they're justifying not worshiping them. If they're not gods, you shouldn't worship them, right? The argument that they're devils or demons is like a separate line of argument from this. That's kind of caught up in this idea. So similarly to how Peter discovered when he was shopping around Magic the Gathering and trying to see what the religious leaders wanted him to change, that he discovered that the thing that was most important to them was that God was the only source of goodness. In the same way, and meaning, therefore, in value, kind of all and authority kind of all get pulled into the one God. then that's not only affecting, are we getting rid of hedge wizards and wise women and so forth? It's also affecting why we're getting rid of the polytheistic deities. None of them rises to God's level, therefore they're not gods. Therefore, instead of having some authority, they have no authority at all. They're like people. There's a lot of material written in the early days, back and forth by classical theologians and philosophers wrestling with these ideas. But there's far more that's written by early Christian church fathers, making these arguments and documenting them in books. And we'll talk about some of those during the 2 years ahead, where we'll look at some of the places where they're making this very argument. So it's interesting. I mean, on the one hand, what you're seeing is a stripping away from other human beings of any justification for them to hold office over each other, or to claim to be better, to deserve to be slave owners. All of that justification is being ripped away under this new Christian theological argument. But at the same time, the justification for the ancient gods to be respected by people is also being stripped away in using similar arguments. And all of those prerogatives that used to belong to men are being reserved for the one God. And all those prerogatives that used to belong to the polytheistic deities are being stripped away to the one God. And of course, he says the ethos of natural rank. He says natural rank because, of course, as you recall, the ancient deities are reflections of nature. They're aspects of nature. And therefore, the prerogatives that they have are actually the prerogatives that nature has. Because in the ancient world, it's nature, God, man. Right? Nature is the ultimate source of authority. So in stripping these polytheistic gods and human beings of all of these prerogatives of rank, what they're really doing fundamentally is stripping nature itself of all of that, all those prerogatives, and reserving those for God alone. So you shouldn't look to nature for any education about how a man should live. You shouldn't look to nature for any kind of value system. You shouldn't look to nature for any magical powers or ability to heal one another. Technology, none of that matters. God has all of it now. The one God has all of it. And this is the process by which nature is demoted from the ultimate source of authority to a meaningless state. It's just a creation. God made it the way he did, but he could have made it any way he wanted to. It's not binding on him at all. He is the opposite of the polytheistic gods, who found their hands tied by nature. They could only act within the hyle, the matter of nature, in their acts of creation. But that's the argument that's being used to justify demoting them from their status as gods, because the one God doesn't have those limitations. He can make something from nothing, ex nihilo, and therefore hyle is not binding upon him at all. His form that he wishes to impose on the cosmos is not a partial control over the cosmos, the way that Poseidon's control of the ocean is a partial control. It's an absolute control. It could be an ocean or not an ocean, or any way that God wants it, it could be. He's not like the others. So this is kind of what we're seeing here. And of course, the thing about this worldview that these early church fathers are putting together and documenting and then taking forth and arguing, against their fellow ancients, is that it is completely incompatible with the ancient ethos. There's nowhere that you could fit in parts of the ancient ethos and make them work within this new framework. This new framework shatters all of the old relationships of value and authority, including the justification for the political economy and everything else about how the ancient world is organized. It's like the question of the Sphinx, where the Sphinx doesn't ask a single riddle to all travelers, but instead asks the one question that brings apart your entire worldview and your view of yourself and how you fit into nature. This is what's happening here, is that these church fathers have found the Achilles heel. I don't know if anybody here ever saw the film Jason and the Argonauts by Ray Harryhausen. It's a famous stop motion animation adaptation of the legend, the myth of Jason and his crew of heroes going to get the Golden Fleece. But there's a scene in it where they have to take on the giant bronze man Talos, and they figure out that he's got a screwed in plug in his heel, and if they can open it up, it'll let out all the hot lava or whatever it is that's inside him that's animating him, and then he'll freeze and collapse and fall to pieces. This is Harryhausen's adaptation of the Achilles heel into the vulnerable spot in Talos, and one likes to believe that one isn't so fragile, that one doesn't have some simple question that could be asked that could make everything come tumbling down. But the concept of the mystery of the Sphinx is based on that idea that all of us as mortals, or who we are and the systems we build have that fragility built into it, because our mortality signs itself on our works, not just in our ideas about the world. And ultimately, from this perspective, what the early church fathers have managed to do is they've managed to unscrew that plug that was holding in everything that made it possible for the ancient world to be animate and cohere and hold together. So once you think these ideas, once you adopt these ideas, you realize that it's not just one or two things you're going to have to change. You're going to have to change the whole world. It's all got to go. This is what makes it a revolutionary new worldview. That's why he says Christianity's theological shore shows mutant elements. This is a mutation of the old ideas that has become something new and something completely incompatible and incomprehensible within the old framework. It shatters the old framework. It's the question to be asked that makes the old framework no longer believable. So, brilliant writing and thinking on the part of the early theologians to find that when centuries and generations of classical writers weren't able to locate it. These guys found it. And of course, later, that's what's going to happen. Martin Luther and others are going to do that same trick against the medieval epoch and bring it tumbling down, which, that's the irony, right, about how these epochs begin and end. And now we're in the modern epoch, and we're in the difficulty where people are dissatisfied with the corruption and difficulties of the modern epoch, but we haven't yet found that plug in Talos's heel that once opened will bring the modern epoch down and make it seem absurd and make it clear that we have to change everything. And what do we change it to? We're not there yet. We're at the point where we're still trapped in a labyrinth. When we try to think about the problem, we think too much within the constraints of the modern worldview's own ideology. And so we keep reinforcing it by our efforts to critique it. But this is, I mean, it's a hugely powerful example he's alluding to here. So thanks for bringing that up, Sharon. Phil, come off mute. Tell us what's on your mind.
Yeah, I was going to bring up the problem of language and its relationship to revisionism. But, Ari mentioned something very interesting that I'm trying to weave into the conversation about what he talked about, about celebration of life and all that. And in this talk, I was thinking, well, at first I was thinking, well, in some sense, he's talking about the relationship between knowledge and being. But then as I thought about it, no, it's actually not that. He's talking about two ways of knowing. A knowing that's existential in many ways, and it's woven into being, in the sense that you celebrate being with others and otherness. So it's not just with your community. I like he brought that out, but it's also with others, and I would extend that to otherness. So that would extend it to nature as well. But however, having said that sort of thing, well, I actually maybe I should extend it a bit more. The thing we have with language is, in some sense, it almost seems that kind of thing that Ari talked about has been suppressed into the unconscious. So you get the Jung, right? In other words, our connection with that otherness is almost like individualized into our unconscious, and it emerged that way rather than actually existing, in the conscious world. So that's an important part. So we replace knowing to a kind of a very deep unconscious knowing that emerged. And it seems to me like that relationship, it's kind of important. But the problem is that we're caught up in this sort of like second order of knowing, which is language. In fact, I find it hard for me to think without language, except when I'm painting, for me in that sense. And so it's not so much at a party as like painting. So part of that exists. So we're so trapped in language, it seems like it changes the meaning of things, like kind of like Marshall McLuhan said, the medium is the message. You might have being trying to infiltrate, but the language, the medium itself, has so captivated our mind that we can't go outside of its boundary very easily. So that's part of the problem. And I'm thinking like, how do we deal with that? Because in the one, I do we try to practice something that's kind of like outside of language, so we could retrieve this uh, other way of thinking, so that we are more in tune with being, and not just sort of like this derivative of being, which is language, which is captured. Uh, maybe you would say an umbrella that shield the sun so that doesn't get to us. So in some sense, it's kind of like, yeah, what do? We had got ourselves into this because we're so clever in inventing language, and particularly through printing, and that it could stabilize the language. So it is in a way the definition of knowing, and in a way a definition of being. So that's problematic. So I just want to bring that out because that's how you. Oh, one more thing I want to say. I was in a Heidegger meeting, and we were talking about Leibniz because he talked about the history of being, and I kind of had a discussion, a kind of almost argument with this guy who's really into Platonism, rationality, and we were arguing about the word ratio, and I reminded him the earlier, which means a kind of conscious knowing of things, rationalization, and I was telling him earlier that we had the idea that about what is it, whatness and thatness, and there's a conscious relationship of trying to like retrieve the thatness out of the whatness, and it seems to me the whatness is a question about what the hell is that, and it emerges, and phases into the thatness. Oh, that's what it is, because we want to objectify, because that the linguistics actually, in some sense, uh, creates an objectification of that. And I was arguing about that, and it's like when we were early thing, we were arguing that word ratio is not Greek. It's a Roman word. It's a Roman word, and I forgot what the replacement with that, which is it's probably something like phusis. So how can you transform phusis into ratio, and then eliminate that? And we said, and there was a guy that I think in that meeting he said, like that's that's where the problem started with Plato, is that this sort of rationalization of the structure created what he said, and I don't know if Plato actually did that. This sort of idealization, and he purposely linked that to idolization of language. We have idolized language so that we no longer see the otherness of being. So that was interesting. We are so much dealing with this sort of conceptual idolization that in some sense we no longer could celebrate with Ari in this festival. I mean, it's like, I thought that was insightful because, yeah, we live in this world which we are worshiping idols
Yes.
in a funny way. So
Yeah.
that's very interesting. That's it. I'll leave it there.
It's great, Phil. Thank you. Yeah, to be hyper rational, to be hyper intellectual, overly abstract, is ultimately to be engaging in idol worship, in
That's
which
right.
the idol is language itself, and
That's right.
our little constructed systems of thinking. That it's right on there. It's interesting, and it goes well with what Ari just posted in the chat. It's nice. Thanks. James, come off mute. Tell us what's on your mind.
Yeah, thank you, Rick. Yeah, relate to what Phil just said in terms of idolization of language. Would you say that the this talking about the medieval rational arguments for God's existence and so forth, is a form of idolization as well, right? And it's based on language. But you know, that kind of idolization associating language with this with a metaphysical being is being undermined by the modernists, aren't they? Would you say that you know, in Wittgenstein, he's got language games are also forms of life, so you can't separate the being, the substance of what you know, what you're involved in relationship with the world. You can't separate the language from that, from being, from the notion, your notion of being, your understanding of what being is. And and so if you go back to Heraclitus, you know, you're talking about, you know, for Heraclitus, is logos is not a priori, you know, or, you know, does not precede, you know, right, the other experiences of your relationship with the world, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's not something that is elevated. That occurred after Plato, right? Or, you know, Plato was one who elevated logos to a higher
Maybe Parmenides. Parmenides.
right? With the idea of forms,
Yes.
right?
They're kind of having a tug of war.
Right.
Is logos, Heraclitus would say logos is more a function of gnosis.
Right.
It is in our experience of nature that we discover it, the logos that underlies it, the hidden harmony. But Parmenides wants to invert that and say, no, it comes from our thinking and our logic.
Well, with Spinoza, is the one who actually you know, argued for the notion that that God is also synonymous with nature, with the substance, right? Ultimate substance, nature. And so he's bringing in these kind of metaphysical idea of God, this metaphysical thinking from the transcendent realm to an eminent realm. He's saying it's one and the same. We are part of nature, and our ideas of God are also part of that natural process of self understanding or seeking of for ultimate sense of being. But it is, yeah, with like Phil was saying, it is a concern with being. It's a matter of what you think that being is. And so for Heraclitus, I think he repeated this quote from him that nature loves to hide. And so is he implying that nature is this ultimate substance, the ultimate you know revelation of what being is? So does that come back to what Spinoza's point is as well? Because, you know, like someone like a scientist like Albert Einstein really loved Spinoza, and he wrote a love letter to Spinoza saying that this is he agreed with Spinoza's view of life, you know, and the universe and idea of God. It's consistent with his scientific theories about thoughts about the universe.
Yeah, I need to read more Spinoza. I've only ever gotten my Spinoza indirectly through other people writing about him. And it's gonna be a few years yet before I can spend time with Spinoza, because now I've got all these medieval theologians to read. So, but I'll get there. I'll get there. You know what? If assuming that your characterization is accurate, it's an interesting thing for Spinoza to do, because if he's equating God with nature, he's inverting 2,000 years of of European history and going back to that classical idea, that the sacred and the natural are united with each other,
Right.
and that it's
Yeah,
humanity.
that's pretty. That's consistent with Nietzsche, right? Nietzsche's also doing this kind of inversion
Yeah.
of the whole, 2,000 years of metaphysical thinking, philosophy.
Yeah.
And we're reading a book, called In the Philosophy by Heidegger, which goes into that very idea that Phil was talking about the ratio and so forth. And Leibniz, he was explicating Leibniz, but I think he's using Leibniz as a kind of a straw man to illustrate what that kind of metaphysical thinking is like when you posit a God by way of rationality, by way of mathematics, calculus, and so forth. It's a God it's a fabrication of one's own human rationality.
Yeah.
Yeah.
See, you can see why the medieval epoch would denigrate nature. I mean, it's got several reasons to do so. And one of them is the claim of the Roman emperors is that they represent the superior nature. That's why they deserve to rule. On the one hand, they claim what we're doing is in alignment with nature. And on the other, they're claiming our inner nature, our character is superior to yours. And you should be ruled by the superior nature. The problem, when you were talking, I was thinking about Sophrosyne, and I was thinking about how the problem for the ancient world is that they didn't start into their hierarchies with the goal of achieving Sophrosyne. They figured out Sophrosyne later. It was part of their rationalization for what they'd already imposed. And the problem is, by the time they discover that governments ought to be organized around Sophrosyne, it's too late to change their own governments. Their governments are already have this huge momentum of power and wealth invested in structures that are in fact in opposition to Sophrosyne. They have people ruling who are not Aristoi and do not care about Sophrosyne. They just pretend to. And as much of a problem as that is in Athens, as Thucydides makes clear in the history of the Peloponnesian War through his examples, it's a far bigger problem in the Roman Empire, where we're not only not ruled by the best, some of the people were ruled by the worst of the worst. Caligula, Commodus, these are not, nobody could mistake them for being the high points of, concern about nature and goodness and health and vitality. So, these are major challenges, and you could see why early church medieval fathers, looking at that claim that they're being ruled by nature, would lead them to say, well, then I don't want any part of nature. Screw you and screw your nature that you claim is better. I'm going to one up your nature and make it irrelevant. I'm going to have a God who's not bound by nature, a transcendental God. So you wonder, for all that we're dependent upon the ancients for this concept of Sophrosyne being so clearly put into words and described, and the relationship to arete and ethos and all those things, you wonder to what extent that was a discovery that they made too late. It's like Hegel with his quote about the owl of Minerva only taking flight with the fall of night. It's you figure this stuff out too late. By the time you figure it out at a philosophical level, you have all this momentum invested in the previous anti-philosophical, systems of domination and usually by that point corruption, and decay. So, if one wanted to make a society governed by a focus on Sophrosyne, what if we try to focus on what's healthy for us as individuals, as families, as communities, for a species, but also the whole ecosystem of the planet? What if Sophrosyne is the guidance? As much as we need to study the Greeks to understand it, it doesn't mean that we should emulate the Greeks. That's why I'm not a Hellenophile. Because if we emulated the Greeks, we'd set up a slave system that was out of sync with Sophrosyne, and then just try to rationalize it using Sophrosyne, which would, we know where that ends. We did that already. Bad things come from that. So in some sense, what the best Greek philosophers were advocating has not yet ever been tried, at least not on a large scale. And by the time the early church fathers come along, there's no evidence left, as Donald pointed out. There's no longer any evidence left anywhere of what would an Aristos look like. What would a society focused on Sophrosune look like? Well, he's certainly not going to see it, in the 300s and 400s under the Roman emperors. So you can see why they'd say, well, nature must be this sucky, hypocritical, corrupt domination, and screw that.
So could you define Sophrosune as being, having a capacity to be aligned with what is one's true nature, and that's what the Aristoi is. That Aristoi understands that.
They're supposed to. That would be the defining, by Aristotle, that would be the defining characteristic of an Aristos, that they are working to simulate in a human being that sophrosune that all animals and plants and fungi and everybody but us basically has, which is they notice the right things, they care about the right things, they pursue the right things, not in some kind of utopian fashion, but they just, their instincts weave them into the greater weave of life far more successfully than whatever it is that people have, which is something very, very, very different. It's a theme we'll come back to, and I'll certainly, as I'll read Spinoza with interest, looking to see to what extent does any of that manifest in it. So thanks for bringing them up. Stephen, come off mute. Tell us what's on your mind.
Yeah, I was going to bring up the issue of inversion, and the great moment of inversion was Feuerbach, one of the great moments anyway, when he decided that since God didn't really exist, therefore God could only be a property of man, of the human herd. And he thought he was onto it there and he was nice and safe. Unfortunately, he had Max Stirner standing next to him saying, "Oh, Feuerbach, that's great. We've gotten rid of God. Fantastic. But your human herd, that's simply an inversion of my ego. How dare you appropriate the humanity that belongs to my ego and try to set it as a God above me?" Poor old Feuerbach, he didn't realise what he had opened himself up to, and there is something a little bit facetious in what Stirner is saying. He's gone reducto ad absurdum. That was his whole point. Another something I was just going to bring up separately to all that was something Rudolf Steiner said about Nietzsche, and it's always made me wonder. He said that Nietzsche could be quite a liar, and by that he brought up the famous case where Nietzsche had assumed all these criticisms of Wagner years before the break. Some claim he had actually written out all the criticisms, and it came down to the point where he finally broke with Wagner. He just opened the drawer and took out the whole manifesto of the anti-Wagnerian manifesto, which he had harboured for years as a catty critic. Now, Rudolf Steiner also said that where Nietzsche was unusual is he had a great inner sensitivity to truth. And I think I'm starting to understand his point, because yesterday, so another person has joined the ranks of what would you call it, the new wave of autism or whatever it is. Everyone's saying they're a high functioning autistic these days. It's and they got all their problems are due to AHAD or whatever it is, and
Asperger's.
Thank you, Sharon. Now, for me, who in my earlier days used insanity as a crutch, I'm well aware of the problems here, that you can see the most incredibly sophisticated people with a profound outward sensitivity to doing things, and yet they'll adopt this inner crutch, which isn't isn't really honest. And I think I finally understood that what's the point that Steiner was trying to make about Nietzsche, that he could quite honestly lie and be catty towards Wagner, but he knew he was lying. And this is very different from people who are full of excuses for themselves. And they make their inner realm, their inner mind foggy. Oh, they finally dispelled all responsibility for their own wickedness. And Steiner's point is this wasn't in Wagner, this wasn't in Nietzsche. He might have been not quite the great quality in the external realm that Wagner was, not the great accomplished, polished external man, but he could inwardly see the truth about himself. He inwardly knew that he was being false. He took responsibility for his own evil internally. Whereas most people, they want to defer the issue. They want to hide the fact that they're responsible for their own wickedness. So they're always blaming somebody else. This is one of the great things in the Bible. From the word go, man makes a mistake. God says, what happened here? It's Eve's fault. Eve, what's going on here? It's the talking snake's fault. There's tremendous wisdom in Genesis, even though it was written down 2,500 years ago, that has been missed today. We live in a blame culture, a culture that refuses to take responsibility for its actions. And this is this internal fogginess, this internal dishonesty that, according to Steiner, Nietzsche was a bit beyond, a bit above. He saw his inner being with a much greater sense of clarity. And that's where Nietzsche's richness lies. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Stephen. Yeah, it's something I've been thinking about since the last time we met. You had some great comments at the end of the session 2 weeks ago, and it really got me thinking about Kenneth Smith's point that he makes repeatedly about the standpoint of Archimedes, the Kafka quote. He was permitted to achieve the Archimedean standpoint on the condition that he used it against himself. It's like, it's not philosophy if you're not critiquing your own belief system. If you only use it to pick apart other people, it's just sophistry. It's just rhetoric. It's just a cheap trick for, making yourself look good and other people look bad. And I think the Stirner's point, is it Stirner or Steiner who said the thing about Nietzsche being self-critical?
That was Steiner.
Steiner, thank you. I don't want to mix
In
those.
his book on Nietzsche, he pointed out that he had this enormous inner sensitivity for
Yes.
truth, which would be painful.
Yes.
Until you learned how to handle it. Ordinary people, as accomplished as they were on the outside, would shoot the messenger.
Is that Friedrich Nietzsche, Fighter for Freedom?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay.
When we go and do something bad and we try to blame it on somebody else, we're refusing responsibility for our own evil. And we're making things worse because we're shooting the messenger. Isn't that what they try to do to the Jews all the time? Supposedly the Jews brought the revelation of God. So all the other nations love to shoot the messenger.
Yes.
This is the thing to watch out for, that if don't defer inner responsibility. If you have to be wicked to survive, be wicked to survive. But assume inner responsibility for your own wickedness.
Yes.
You might have to lie to others, but be wary of lying to yourself.
Or put another way into the modern parlance, own your own bullshit. It's people people who generate problems and then try to pretend that it wasn't them and it's not their issue. It's like, no,
Well,
you know what? You at least need to be clear about the things you're generating that are a problem. You know,
this is another one from Steiner's direction, and as a concept. Of course, he didn't live at the time, but when the Germans at the end of World War II said, "Oh, it's not our fault," it was that bad guy Hitler.
yeah,
Like he did it all on his own. And this is the old game of deferring blame.
right.
Hitler was being used as the whipping boy of God.
Yeah. One person by themselves couldn't possibly have created the Holocaust. That took a lot of science and industry and technology and mass support. And maybe afterwards, all those people would like to scapegoat Hitler in order to hide their own culpability in it. But philosophical rigor requires us to acknowledge when we've contributed to something. I'd say, you know, Steiner, I think Kenneth Smith would agree, and I certainly agree. Steiner's point about Nietzsche, we totally agree. It's one of the things that it's part of why Nietzsche has to be read from beginning to end. You really can't just cherry pick Nietzsche, because at any given point he's having a dialogue with his own previous writings and critiquing them as, you know, where are they inadequate, where were my old ideas wrong, and how do I grow from here. And it's why Kenneth Smith says that it's hard to pin Nietzsche down as any particular kind of philosopher except a vitalist. He's concerned with what is healthy. And the healthy thing is to not live a lie, and to find where one is being a hypocrite and hiding from one's responsibilities, and to address it, do better, you know, tomorrow than you did yesterday. And you can see that. You're right, Stephen. You see it in Nietzsche's writing, where he may have harsh things to say about Hegel or Schopenhauer or other philosophers, but man, it's not half as harsh as he directs against himself. It's like, where have I fallen short? Where have I been inadequate? You know.
Well, you know, if you get the message, you know, comes in the post, you open it up and it says you're being a total dick. You don't have to act on it, but don't burn the message.
You still have to recognize it. Yeah. Thanks, Stephen. So let's do this transition into paragraph 13 that Sharon took us into. I want to start with the last couple sentences of paragraph 12, and I think, was it Donald already did the second of the two, so let's just do sentence 7. The Greek Peleus thrived on an aristocratic consensus about what was worthy and sane, a moral and political hygiene among well-honed connoisseurs. Such moral communities proved transient, and their wholeness was now ruptured and septic. So he's talking about that concept that, generally speaking, although they had plenty of examples to the contrary, the Greeks preferred to be ruled by many aristoi rather than few aristoi, or only one aristos. They didn't, you know, the smaller the number of people making the decision, the greater the odds that person's blind spots, you know, if you hand them power, now become the blind spots of the entire society. What you want is competing ideas. You want, you know, the rabbinical tradition of healthy debate and discussion and wrestling with an angel, you know, and wrestling with the text is supposed to be that this is the heuristic ideal, right? That you're by doing that, one person's blind spots get compensated for by another person who doesn't have those blind spots. They can point out to each other where they're missing things, and you can end up with a decision that's better than any one of them could have made. This is their ideal. They want a bunch of aristoi to get together and hash out the problem, and preferably not by voting. Notice he uses the word an heuristic consensus, right? Because maybe the guy you're out voting is the only one who sees the problem with what you're about to do. What you really want to do is do justice to the issues. I'm quoting Socrates, right? Do justice to the rights of the question. You really want to fully explore the question and understand all the aspects of it, so that your action that you take removes as many blind spots as you're capable of identifying. You know, even if it's only one guy that sees the problem, if he shares it with the rest and they approach it, you know, with the goal of understanding rather than domination, then they can learn to see what he sees. They can take it into themselves. and the resulting governance decisions can therefore remove the blind spot that all but one people had. So this is the objective. And the problem is those structures that they tried to introduce that into within the Greek political economy were too fragile and had too much momentum from an earlier age that was not dominated by heuristic structures. And so they were only able to partially, put it into play. And certainly after Solon's revisions of the Athenian constitution, a number of the people making the decisions weren't Aristoi at all. Right? They were Banausoi. They were tradesmen, and their goal was to get rich. And so they dragged Athens and thus the entire Greek world into a gigantic war to try to open up trade routes in the Western Mediterranean that led to the collapse of Greek civilization. Once you put people into the position of decision making, you can call it governance, but if you put people into that position who don't have sophrosune and don't even want sophrosune because they don't recognize sophrosune as a good thing, people who see it as impractical, it's getting in the way of making a quick decision, and the quick decision they want is give me what I want, do what I want to do, and anything that gets in the way of that's a problem. As soon as you put people like that in the position of making decisions, you're well down the road to wrecking your civilization, as Athens demonstrated. And of course, they didn't just wreck Athenian civilization. The series of concatenating catastrophes that happened, not just to them, but then to Sparta and Corinth and Thebes as different hegemonies rise up over the decades that followed, they really managed to take everything apart. So when he talks about them being transient, this is part of what he's talking about. Is he's not trying to, Kenneth here, not trying to explain in a diagnostic way what went wrong and how do we avoid it. He's just noting that this is how it turned out. They knew they had a strong sense of how they ought to be governing their societies, but they weren't able to hold it together. It fell apart. And a few centuries later, we've got Rome, and we're being ruled by what Kenneth calls a kakistocracy, ruled by the worst rather than by the best. Ruled by egotistical power mongers whose only goal is to increase their power and wealth and make it more secure, which is the opposite of sophrosune, right? This is not looking towards the long-term health and vitality of even themselves, right? Because I think he talked about this in chapter 4. What is inconceivable to a Banausos or a doulos is that they're not the best judge of what they need. It's inconceivable. It's like, I need the bomb and I need to drop it right now so that I win because it gets me what I want. It's like that no, sir. What you need is a nap. You need to, maybe you're hungry, have a Snickers. It's like what they actually need at the moment may have nothing to do with their grand visions of, there could be only one and it must be me. They can't conceive of the idea that they're wrong in their desires. Whereas in Aristos, almost the defining characteristic of an Aristos that leads them to even care about sophrosune is not just the recognition, but the enthusiastic recognition that the Aristos's own desires are probably wrong. Right? The Aristos has that thing Stephen's talking about that Nietzsche, had some of, even though he didn't have all of it, but he had some of. To know that you're an unreliable narrator, to know that your own desires are not God's own truth, to know that you need to question what it is that you want and look hard at the problem, to look past the surface, to figure out what might really be healthy underneath that. That's the defining characteristic that makes it possible for people to look for something beyond their own desires and ego and plans and ideologies, to say that there's something more out there, and that something more is how we should govern society. That thing that's that hidden harmony that's not obvious that we should be searching for. So fragility, right? It falls apart because for whatever reason, they weren't able to sustain it, and we ended up with rule by the worst. So what we see is that, first of all, it doesn't necessarily mean, I've thought a lot about this sentence 7 since we first started into this chapter. The modern conclusion would be, oh, well, that proves it doesn't work. It might be a fine ideal, but it doesn't work. But of course, what that hides is the fact that it was never quite working, right? Because out of the gate, that wasn't the government they started with. That was the government they tried to change their government into. First, they took the government they had, which wasn't this, and they claimed to be this because that was how they rationalized, dominating the peoples that they conquered. So they started from a position of hypocrisy. But over time, they moved into a normative position where they said, no, we really should govern ourselves the way that we claim that we do. And that was some wisdom, the realization that these were better ideas than what they were actually practicing. But the problem was by then there was too much momentum, it was too late. So it basically means that what we saw was fragile because it was an attempt to retroactively edit an existing moving thing into a better form, and it came too late. So in some sense, they discovered something that hasn't really been fully tried yet, is one way to put this. Governance by Soprasune, governance by Aristoi, is a very interesting idea that they show us glimpses and glimmers of, but never quite achieve themselves. So, I'm not sure that Kenneth fully means what I'm saying now. I would have to have a discussion with him about this. But I reading between the lines, and also reading the history, I think this is probably a more complete characterization of what happened. It wasn't a fragile thing that broke. It was, they tried to reverse engineer themselves into something better than they had, and they only partially succeeded because they started too late in the process. And what fell apart was the partially reverse engineered system. At any rate, however it happened, this is the circumstances that lead to what Donald was talking about. After it's falling apart, once it becomes, the practical rule, which means focus on what makes me strong. How do I win? How do I get what I want? Once it decayed to that point, then you had a circumstance in which it was certainly impossible to reverse engineer after that point, because now you had people in charge who weren't even pretending that was what they wanted. What they wanted was to be in charge. So this is the circumstances on which the medieval framework arises and says this has all got to go. Phil, come off mute. Tell us what's on your mind.
Yes, from what you explained, it almost seems like at least our brand of democracy is doomed for a couple of reasons. We don't have the Aristoids, and even if we did, none of them wanted to be in the government. Okay, but second of all, since we believe in a sense, kind of in a sense, one man, one vote, even though we don't do whatever it is. But even in our jury trials, don't we have the concept of a trial by one's peers? In other words, you don't want an Aristotle in there in a funny way, right? You want somebody, it's like you, because they're judging you and they should have your perspective or something like that sort. So both the content and the form, and I'm not even going to talk about other things like racism and all that, but just the content and the form seem to be the case. Now, I have a little doubts about, I mean, you're pushing maybe a little too hard in my mind about Aristoids. I mean, I believe in that concept, but I also believe in like people who are not Aristoids, that they deserve to live and be part of civilization as well. So that becomes a sticky point for me in some sense. Like, you can't just like leave them out of the decision making. It doesn't seem right. They're part of the society. I mean, even people who are crippled or even got mentally challenged, you still consider them as part of society. So you can't really have that extreme of a hierarchy, and and say that, oh, everything is fine because they'll take care of business. We're just gonna live by the virtues of what they see. So I do have some mixed feelings, even though I believe in both situations. How do you mix that relationship? It seems even harder than relationship between the Christian transcendental spirit and the Roman concreteness in action. I mean, how do you make that synthesis? That's it, Phil.
Thanks, Phil. Yeah, it's part of what's interesting about this is that if an Aristos recognizes, I mean, if among the defining characteristics of an Aristos is self-criticism, if they recognize their limitations, then the last thing in the world they want is to be in charge of everything. Even as part of a gigantic committee of other Aristoi, you don't want to be in charge of everything. What you want is to have more of a say on the things that you're best at and less of a say on the things that you're worst at, because you recognize you're worst at those things. You shouldn't, like, I mean, if we're going to have an operation on my wife, I want Sharon to say about the anesthesia. I want to have no say at all. At all. I do not want to vote, right? I mean, I don't want any part of it because I know I'm completely incompetent in this area.
So let me cut in there because that's interesting. You're proposing that. You're not talking about a unified government like the Congress or the president. You're talking about the bureaucracy needs to be maintained. Is at that level that in a sense you need the Aristos. I mean, the people who are competent in what they do. Because if you fire those people, then you really have chaos. I agree with that part.
Yeah. Yeah, see, I was lucky. It was my experience with the VA during their golden age. You know, the 80s and 90s were a golden age at the VA, where they developed their own healthcare software, and the people who did the developing, who were in charge of what was done, were the medical professionals. So the medical professionals, they didn't tell us what language to use or what database to use or data structure. They didn't talk about any of the computer side, but they had all the say about the medical side, right? Because they know the medicine. And they didn't put them into a giant pool and have all the nurses trying to outvote the lab techs. They had separate groups. The lab techs had control over the lab software. The nurses had control over the nursing software. And they would tell us what they needed. And this, by the way, is how you can involve Duloi and Banausoi in government without putting them in charge of it. Is you say, you're in charge of telling me what your problems are. What are you struggling with? Why should government even exist? It should exist to address these issues. So what's the biggest problem in your life today? And so it sets priorities, right? A doulos can contribute at that level and say, look, I'm really having a problem, you know, with these things. I may not know what the right thing is to do, but I know I'm having a problem. And I can make sure.
I have a smaller personal version of that. I remember when I was teaching at the University of Wisconsin at Milwaukee, and I was teaching a beginning class in foundation art, which I know quite a lot about. And they realized it was quite structured. And one of the students says, why can't we have more freedom to do what we want? And I said, well, freedom will come later when you understand what the hell's going on. And he started challenging the whole democratic ideal. And I said, oh no! If that's the case, you're free to do whatever you want. You just got to remember that when it comes to grading and evaluating, I'm free to do what I want.
Yes.
So we're both free. That's fine. Do your thing.
Yes.
He understood that.
Yes. Yeah, I mean, the person who lives on the street with the pothole has a certain wisdom that nobody else in the world has, right? I mean, to other people, the pothole's some kind of abstraction, but the person who actually drives over it and blows out their tire knows things about that pothole nobody else knows. And so when it comes to establishing priorities, you really want the person most closely connected to the problem to have a voice in bringing that to everybody's attention. And, you know, that's going to be wherever the problem occurs. Doulos, Banausos, Aristos, whoever runs into the problem has a special say. But it doesn't mean that the person who blew out their tire and knows that the pothole needs to be fixed, it doesn't mean that they know how to fix it. And it also doesn't mean they know whether it's the first pothole that has to be fixed. There may be another one somewhere else that's bigger. right? That's a bigger, like in front of a school. It's a bigger problem. Kids are falling into this pothole. We're gonna fix that one before we fix yours. Your car blew out its tire, and that's a bad thing. So it goes on the list, but it does not go above the pothole that children are falling into, right? So there's a way in which there's a cooperation that happens, a dialectic between what are the resources we have and what are the problems we have, and how do we figure out how the two go together. And what our experience in the VA was, if you put either side in charge of the whole thing, it all falls apart. Because the people who are not actually having the problem are the worst in the world to decide where we should focus our attention, right? They don't really know. They're not living the life, right? If the nurse has a prompt that is confusing as hell, and every time a new nurse comes on, they have to train them, ignore what it says, it actually means this, and there's a high rate of errors, and sometimes it hurts patients because they don't know what to put there. The nurse knows that better than the person who wrote the code. The person who wrote the code isn't actually using the prompt in their day-to-day life, right? The last time they thought about that prompt was when they wrote it 8 years ago. They haven't since then. It's been out of their mind entirely. Whereas to the nurse, it's like front and center all the time, right there. So I bring this up as an example because we were able to this day, despite 25 years of neglect by the VA, well, they've been trying to replace this system. If you look at the ratings by people who actually use medical software, this software is still number one. And the reason it's number one is it may be out of date, but it was designed by the people who use it, and they set the priorities in this way. And the lesson that I draw from that is, we used that to govern an incredibly complicated nationwide, enterprise. This isn't like, Engels and Marx's primitive communism that supposedly all tribes lived according to, and now we'll just scale it up so it runs the world. This is something that was being used on a national scale as a decision-making system. There's probably lots of decision-making systems that this would be inappropriate for context, like, if you're fighting a war, God knows you should do anything like this. But for a lot of circumstances, this gives you a way that you can relate experts and non-experts together in a way that's productive, where everybody's contributing something essential without resorting to the violence of voting. Because voting is violence, right? Voting is where you say, shut up, we outvoted you. Shut up or else we bring in the police. You have to do what we say because we said so, because there's more of us than there are of you. There's always implicit violence in voting. And Nietzsche would say, with this rise of power that's involved in voting, there's stupidity, which is, I never seriously looked at your minority position because I knew I had the votes to beat you. So I just focused on, could I get enough votes? And I didn't focus on, but what if you're right and I'm wrong? What if the majority is wrong about this situation, the minority has it right? This is where the old heuristic ideal of you really need the agon of the back and forth. You need to really struggle with the issues to figure out if you're doing justice to the rights of the question. They're right on the money on that. I can't tell you how many times, in my work in medical software, I've run across situations where the majority was wrong, and it was the minority that was right. And that minority might have just been the one person who had the problem and everybody else wanted to ignore it. But that one person knew it was actually impeding, the ability to take care of patients.
Well, this does depend on the fact that you trust at least a majority of the people, overwhelming majority of people, does have in their consciousness a fairness about things, right? In other words, if everybody in the decision making is sort of unfair, then even beyond Aristoids, I mean, like, it would not work. But if everybody's fair, at least they understand what the situation is. And it's good to be fair to the people that might be disadvantaged or whatever. The fairness becomes a very important human value.
Fairness is certainly a critical part of it. But another critical part of it is reducing the number of people involved in making the decision as much as possible. Because, like, if it's about anesthesia software and it's a discussion between the anesthesia programmers and the anesthesiologists, I should not have any say at all. Right? Even though of all the people on this call, I'm the only Vista expert. I'm the only one who actually knows the software. What I don't know is the anesthesia software. I didn't write that. Right? You want to have the anesthesia programmer talking to Sharon. You don't want me anywhere near there. And so what happens is when you reduce the number of people who are involved in the decision to just the people who have a stake in it, first of all, most of the problems go away. Because if you assume con men and trolls are evenly scattered across the population, by simply eliminating most of the population from the decision, you've eliminated most of the trolls and con men, haven't you? Right? I mean, if I'm a con man, but I'm excluded because I don't know anything about anesthesia or the anesthesia software, then I've been put out without anybody having to figure out whether or not I'm a con man. I'm automatic. The decision just got better by not being involved in it. And this is a hard thing for people in the modern world to understand because it's beaten into us. Democracy is good. Democracy will fix all problems. Just let everybody vote. But for most problems, the worst thing in the world you could do is to try to ask everybody their opinion, especially if they know, not only if they know nothing about it, but because they don't have a stake in it. If it ends badly, so what? They don't care, right? It's not their fish to fry. They're involved because they're bored. Like, hey, it's my right to vote, and I like him better than her, so I'm voting with him. It's like, oh, but she was right. It's like, the worst thing the world wants to do is to introduce more people who have nothing better to do than to fiddle with it because they're bored. I look at the local elections. You know how many times there's judges up for re-election in Washington State, and nobody knows any of these judges. I mean, like a handful of people knows the judges. Everybody else is making their decision by some sort of irrelevant secondhand bullshit. And I include myself in that. You know, I read everything I can about these people to try to figure out, you know, is one of them in trouble with the law? Did one of them sleep with their interns? You know, is one of them consistently, you know, voting to tear apart this, that, or the other? But at the end of the day, I really don't know what I'm doing when I'm voting for these people. No, I don't. It's a stupid way to get judges into the courts in Washington State. And I say that as you know, a highly educated, intelligent person. My contribution is probably to make things worse. I may not know what the right thing is to do, but I do know that adding me to the equation is not improving it. This is one of those things, you know. With Aristotle, this is very easy to explain. Aristotle makes it very clear. His focus is relentlessly on sophrosyne. What is the healthy thing to do in this situation is really the only consideration. What makes things better? From that perspective, that's how these decisions should be made for Aristotle. But for us, we have so many ideological things pulling on us. Oh, but it's not fair if it's not a democracy. So everybody needs to vote. Okay, everybody line up. Let's vote. Oh my God. It's why Aristotle says, if democracy is among the best forms of government, if all of the people voting are focused on sophrosyne. If they're focusing on what's best, then yeah, then democracy is great. But in any other circumstances, democracy is awful. It could be one of the very worst governments. You know, it's the key issue is not how many people you have. It's whether you're focusing on the right thing. Anyway, I'm belaboring this, but the point is to set up the value transfiguration that happens from paragraph 12 to paragraph 13. And we're saying we're now, instead of having people, you know, instead of trying to distinguish between people, instead of discriminating between people on the basis of their character and trying to get people of good character making decisions, we're going to now pretend everybody's the same. So we're inviting all the trolls and con men back in. Come on in. Let's all make this decision together. We're all brothers and sisters together. And, you know, we're going to try to create this new society. And in this society, although we're all brothers and sisters together, we are actually going to have this one hierarchy, as Ari pointed out. Some people are going to be those, not going to be those who work, they're going to be those who fight, who get to make a lot of decisions. And some of them are going to be those who pray, and they get to make a lot of decisions. And those who work don't get to make very many decisions. So now that all the trolls and con men are in the group and we're all deciding who wants to go where do you think the trolls and con men want to go? You think they want to be in those who work and don't get much of a say? Or do you think they want to be among those who fight or pray and get to have a lot of say? This is the problem that comes out of the gate with the you know, creation of the medieval epoch. The ideology is getting in the way of discriminating between who has your best interests at heart and who actually wants to live like a parasite. We're sort of pretending there aren't any trolls or con men. I even though this is a point that we're gonna explore over the next 2 years, it's one of the points that Kenneth Smith makes about the medieval epoch. He says the medieval epoch is the era in which the Banausoi perfected themselves. The reason the modern epoch follows the medieval epoch is that, on the one hand, saying we're all equal while simultaneously setting up a hierarchy that isn't equal, but pretending you didn't do that. It creates just the kind of niches in society that escape being properly examined and held accountable. And those are exactly the niches that Banausoi want. Okay? I mean, if you want the most power and the most money possible, the last thing in the world you want is accountability. You want to find the niches that society's created for you. It's like in modern society. You're going to find Banausoi, in the CIA, in the NSA, in military intelligence, anywhere where you're not allowed to be, Homeland Security, anywhere you're not allowed to be questioned, where you're the one who does the questioning, Banausoi are going to flock to those spots because that's the only place they could go without being held accountable. The last thing in the world they want to be is the guy at the other end of the spotlight being looked at and examined to see if he's been robbing people. It's like, no, I want to rob people and not have anyone look at me. So if society creates those niches for me and I have those goals and desires, I'm good. Unlike everybody else around me who have other things to distract them, I'm going to have a single point of focus, which is to place myself in those roles. Because I need it more than they do. People who aren't busy ripping each other off maybe can stand a little scrutiny. I can't. I've got to get into those spots. I mean, I could question my life choices and try to be a better person, but given the character I have, that's never going to happen. So, in my imagination, my only chance at survival is to get in charge under these circumstances. So this is kind of the problem that's being set in motion. Kenneth talks about the ancient world as having far too late discovered Banausoi. They go into it thinking that there's only two classes, the Aristoi and the Douloi. But by the time Athens is dragging the whole world into the Peloponnesian War, they're starting to realize that they did a terrible thing when they gave the Banausoi the vote. And that the Banausoi, they're not strange Douloi and they're not strange Aristoi. They're a third character type that they didn't realize was there. But by the time they find it out, it's too late and they fall to pieces. And then the medieval epoch is the epoch in which Banausoi perfect themselves. They learn how to use control of information and hypocrisy to get in charge of large numbers of people. This is one of the points Sharon makes. When is religion used as a tool of liberation and goodness, and when is it used as a tool of control? Well, to a Banausos, of course, it's a tool for control. There aren't any other kinds of tools to the Banausos. So, this is how they try to wield. There's a tug of war that happens throughout the medieval epoch between the people who wanted religion to be good and to be the solution to the problems that Rome posed the world, on the one hand, and on the other hand, the people who look at the burgeoning religious empire and say, this is a great tool for controlling a lot of people. I have to get in charge of this. How do I do that? How do I become an archbishop? I need to get into these spots. I want to be the one voting for Pope. So there's this tug of war happening for the next 1,000 years. And then he says the modern epoch is the epoch in which the Banausoi throw off God and all pretense and just take charge openly. Yay, we're all free. We can be who we want.
I was just going to say democracy. I'm glad you see it has its downsides, because everywhere everyone thinks it's the universal panacea.
Yeah.
But unfortunately, I've seen democracy often means a gang of little kids voting for the cookie jar, and they eat themselves and make themselves sick.
Yes.
And I think that was seen with the Greeks. I was just going to mention, I think in Pursuit of Axiology, I just noticed a good one. What's his name? Ty Negan. Value collapse. He's introduced this trendy new term, value collapse. So don't be frightened by it. But I've put the link in the chat there. So I found this little talk he was doing particularly enlightening. It'll take me a bit to get through it, but I thought it might be of great interest to you because I think it's one of the more interesting things I've come across on axiology. Thank you.
Thank you, Stephen. So this is Aristotle's point in his writings on governance, is that we're all obsessed with the arithmetic distinction between rule by the one, rule by the few, and rule by the many, and we think that that's the source of or cure for problems in governance. And Aristotle says, well, you will get different problems in these three forms of government. And you can trade in one set of problems for another, but you aren't really going to solve problems unless you distinguish the character of the people doing the voting, regardless of whether there's one of them or a few of them or many of them. Are they con artists? If they're con artists and predators, then it doesn't matter whether you've got one of them voting or a few of them or a lot of them. They're still con artists. It's going to be ruin for everybody, and likewise, if the people who are voting are clueless and selfish, they may not even actually be con artists, but they're just clueless and selfish and they don't care about other people, then a democracy can be horrible. And he says you really shouldn't use a single word like democracy to describe both rule by a lot of people who care about one another and rule by a lot of people who are out to screw one another. Because these really are two different forms of government. And to merge them together just because they share in common that there's a lot is to erase the distinction that one of them is predatory and the other one is trying to actually do good in the world. He says that's the fundamental distinction you have to make first. We're back to Sophrosyne, right? That's his core point. Without Sophrosyne, all of the ways we use language, the ways we make decisions, they're all so corrupted that we fail to distinguish food from poison because we've used the same word for both. And it's the power that has over us when the language changes to make it impossible to distinguish food from poison, and we just use a single word that refers to them both. It says that power can drag entire populations into poisoning themselves. Because after all, it's food. Why should they care? They put it in their mouth and they eat it. And that means they feel better, except of course they're sick, but no relation, right? Obviously not connected because they ate food. So it's hard to think clearly when you lack this terminology. All right, so we got another hour to go and we got paragraph 13. I think we're going to do, or no, we're at 2. We're at the end. We're at the end of our session. Yeah. We're at the end of our session. Rick can't do math. Okay, so we're not going to get through paragraph 13 today, but we got into it, which is a good start.
You're going to have to go to that timekeeping class. They won't let you on a ship.
I know, right?
So I got a quick question for Ari. Ari, are you still there?
He is. Come off mute, Ari. Oh, maybe he's not.
Maybe he's not.
No, I'm here. I'm actually, strangely, I was at a chiropractor appointment just listening to everybody. But
so I got
can
a quick question for you. I got a quick question
sure.
for you. What did you think of the effectiveness of the 3-minute timer in last night's meeting?
Well, I feel like with the Canadians, they're like very good at self-regulating and being very kind. And for other people, I feel like it didn't work as well.
Okay.
But are you making an inference that maybe we should do something like that in this group? Because people like me tend to ramble on for too long.
I'm just putting it out there.
We've used a 5-minute timer before.
This is a 3-minute timer.
3-minute time. I'm open. Look, my attitude is always the same with these things. I'm willing to try things and then get feedback on what people think.
I thought it worked very well. I thought it worked very well. It allowed more people to put forward.
But at the same time, I'll be honest. Someone like Phil, who has a slower way of speaking and he has a very methodical way of speaking, it might be less agreeable to other people. But I love it sometimes when he speaks for like 7 or 8 minutes because he has so much clarity and richness. And it's like, for me, I want that. But if that's not good for the group, then I understand. It's just my opinion. So, I'm in this case, I assume everybody's a good actor. And I also have an extremely long attention span so that I can listen to someone speak for an hour and just be enthralled, which, when Rick goes and speaks, I just love how he speaks because it's full of content. And it's when it's like a lecture series full of, like a master class, it's fantastic. It's when it's less coherent that I get upset. But like there's other things that Steven and Donald, and also I love it. But the trade-off is I love when people get to have comments where they get to go back and forth. So it's a bunch of trade-offs, and I'm open to whatever. But I think that the goal, it works like this. The trend I would say like this. In a very large group like last night where there's 30, 40, 50 people, 2 minutes, 3 minutes is necessary. In a small group where we know each other, I don't even know if a timer is necessary. And people, you could just come in and say, Sharon or Rick, say, hey, Ari, you're talking to for too long. Could you wrap it up? And I'm not going to get offended. I'll be like, oh, sorry, guys. So that's my approach, because I really love it when some people give a really great soliloquy. I don't want that to get ruined, but at the same time, I want space for everyone to be engaged. So that's my opinion.
Well, there's your 3-minute answer. It's dependent on group size.
Yeah, that's interesting. But maybe we'll try reintroducing it as a guideline rather than as a hard rule, and see what happens.
That was the first time I saw it, and I thought it worked very well. But
Yeah.
Ari introduced its efficiency in the presence of group size, and I guess that's why it works so well, because there are a lot of people on the call.
That makes sense.
I think we should all speak like Heraclitus. We're limited to one sentence, and we are to pack it as densely as we can. So we need to sort of rehearse it ahead of time.
Hardest thing to do is to speak simply.
Spend a week writing each sentence so that it's just as dense as possible.
Right.
Okay. No offense to anyone. I just wanted an opinion.
No, it's a good one. Have a great week, everyone.
All right.
Bye,
Bye-bye.
Rick.
Bye.
Bye, Sharon.
Bye.